Hi, everyone. Can I have your attention, please? We're going to get started. Hi, I'm just going to keep this extremely quick because we have a long program today and a long program tonight and another one tomorrow and another one tomorrow again. And I hope some of you were there last night as well. My name's Eli Copeland. I'm the program manager here at Giorno Poetry Systems. I'm really, really grateful to Omar, Berrada, and Simone Fattal for organizing this unbelievable symposium on Etel Adnan. We're extremely grateful to Nicole and to Marin at the Poetry Project for all of their invaluable help in organizing the entire thing. We were really just kind of handed this program as like a perfect, beautiful gift, and it's really an honor to be hosting such a portion of it here. If just a quick few notes, we're going to go through, the bathroom is over there. If you need to use it, please feel free to stand up at any time, because I don't think, we will take a coffee break, but there's only one stall, and so the line will be long at that moment. So just be prepared for that. If you need to leave at any moment, you can go downstairs, and there's a red button next to the door. Press that to unlock the door and the gate. Don't check your phone and hang out in the middle of the door and the gate because you will get locked inside that interstice. And so I'm just going to hand it off to Omar now, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Eli. Before I forget, an extra note about the bathroom. What you need to do is close the first door, this one, because the door of the stall doesn't close. So this is the door you need to close. Don't say I didn't tell you. Thank you, Eli. It's been such a pleasure to work with Eli and the team here, which is a tiny, tiny team. And so thanks to you and to Anthony, thanks to the whole team at the Poetry Project, to the team at the Anthology Film Archives that hosted us yesterday, and Bidoun, who hosted the screening. And thank you very much to White Cube Gallery, Galerie Le Long, and Sphere Semler Gallery, who are three galleries that represent Etel's visual work and whose support has been instrumental in making this symposium happen. I would like to thank the speakers who you will hear today, tomorrow, and tomorrow for their enthusiasm and also their seriousness. They took me seriously when I said I wanted them to make something new for this symposium. So they've been writing, they've been thinking, and I look forward to hearing all of it. Special thanks to Hamid Sinnu, who, in addition to doing the final closing performance tomorrow night here, also designed our visual materials. So the posters that are on the table over there that fold into a program pamphlet, feel free to take one and keep it with you. That's Hamid's doing. Of course, thank you, Simone, for your trust and guidance. And I will let Simone say something as an introduction. I will do a little more introduction after she speaks.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for being there. It's such a pleasure to see so many friends and everybody else who want to come and hear about Etel. This seminar is celebrating the 100th anniversary of her birth, and I wanted specially to organize this seminar to speak about her writing, her writing, because she is very well known all over the world, but she's not really read. Of course, in this audience where so many scholars, poets, friends know her work, but actually in the other world, not so much. It's not because the painting has been famous lately, but not a little bit, but not only. Because Etel published in the very obscure magazines, published with still more obscure publishing houses. And it was always like that. And she would type a poem and send it without any copy. She used her manual typewriter all the way till 2006. It's only in 2006, because of the war in Lebanon, that she wanted to read the newspapers, and she taught herself to read the computer overnight. And then she started writing on the computer. So we have some copies now. But here, Patrice Cotensin is a publisher and, of course, director of the Le Long Gallery. He is looking everywhere in the world for all what she has written and published. It's a task. Anyway, what I want to say really is that Etel, although she made Lebanon the center of her work, it was the center of her being, her preoccupation. She made the history of that country the center of her work. But everywhere she went, she did the same. She went to Paris and wrote a fantastic book on Paris. Many people told her, so many people want to write on Paris, you are the one who have succeeded. She went to California. She was actually the only one among all our painter friends to look out of the window. They all painted their gardens, their houses, and not at all Mount Tamalpais. Now it has become an icon. And this, let me see my notes. Okay, so but all of that, I mean, you know that she was a journalist, a poet, an essayist, a novelist, but she was first and foremost a teacher. Everything she wrote was to tell people something. I will stop here.
Thank you, Simone. I just want to share 4 short evocations of Etel in the form of an introduction in relation to the title we chose for the symposium, Etel Adnan in the Rhythms of the World. And I'll follow each evocation with a quote from her work. At the screening last night at Anthology, Simone mentioned how much Etel was a cinephile, how much she loved to go to the movies from when she was a teenager, her love for Greta Garbo, and the fact that when she was a professor at Dominican College in San Rafael in California, between 58 and 72, she used to take her students to Berkeley to watch films that Pauline Kael was screening in a garage. And apparently the nuns at the Dominican College were like, why would you take them to Berkeley? We have a cinema on 4th Street here. But of course, not the same films. So mind you, these are students in a course of philosophy in the 60s. Who was doing that? Etel taught aesthetic philosophy at Dominican College. And this anecdote reminded me of something else that Etel told me about, which is that when she started teaching philosophy at Dominican College, she realized that her students did not know and were not really interested in what was going on in the world outside of their familiar spheres. So what she did is she decided they had to read the newspaper, and it was part of the syllabus. Every session, they had to read the newspaper for that day. So that's what philosophy class started, how it started. In Of Cities and Women, she writes, I know that seeking political and philosophical notions in the street is like trying to construct a barrier to hold back the ocean, but I won't look elsewhere. There is a misconception that few people knew about Etel until Documenta 2012, when her paintings were shown to the world. It may be true of mainstream Western art circles, but I know that Etel had been a legend in other parts of the world before that, for decades. But still, 15 years ago, when the art world finally caught up, her rhythms started to change. She had to produce more work for galleries and exhibitions. She had visitors showing up at her door all the time. And I asked her once if that was not too annoying. And she said it was a bit tiring, but that she enjoyed the excitement. And then she added, after all, I was able to work at my own rhythm for 80 years. Which is another way of saying she was always in the present. In her book Night, she writes, I followed lines I never saw, went on unchartered roads, didn't emerge from any confusion. The present was forever blowing. There's an essay of Etel's that I'm sure many of you know. It's titled The Cost for Love We Are Not Willing to Pay, where she says that love in all its forms is the most dangerous and unpredictable matter we will ever face, but that it is also the only salvation she knows of. For me, it's a bit similar to what Baldwin, who was the same age as Etel, said in an interview, that love has never been a popular movement and no one's ever wanted really to be free. The world is held together, really it is held together by the love and the passion of very few people. In the essay that I mentioned, Etel singles out the Sufi mystic Al-Hallaj and also the philosopher Nietzsche as figures who self-sacrificed for their radical commitments. But there are others that she identified with this pursuit. For instance, I can't tell you how many times, and I don't know why, but how many times Etel asked me over the years, as though to reassure herself, as though to make sure whether I had read the autobiography of Malcolm X. She would say it was one of the world's greatest books. For her, revolution was truly a form of love. And I think what makes the protagonist of her novel Sit Mary Rose revolutionary is not so much her betrayal of her clan, but really her love for the Palestinians and for the children, the disabled children she cared for in the middle of a civil war. And to me, I would add to Al-Hallaj and Nietzsche, I would add Malcolm X and Mary Rose in that list of people who knew there was a cost for love, who were murdered in their prime, and who were willing to pay that cost. And Etel's work reminds us that they did not pay it in vain. In Journey to Mount Tamalpais, she writes, on KPFA, George Jackson is speaking. We hear a tape made while he was still alive and in prison. He has many voices blended in one, many accents. He cuts his sentences short, sounding like an Englishman. Then his voice slides between his lips, and his longest word, his most important one, the one pronounced with a long, burning, agonizing, pleading, and ever-sure voice, is the word love. When you believe in this kind of love, you cannot be pessimistic, because you know that some things cannot be taken away. And I just want to read a passage from Etel's long poem, Spreading Clouds. It's a poem dedicated to June Jordan, who was her friend and who went to Nicaragua in 1984 to be a witness to revolution. And I think that poem has one of the most beautiful stanzas in the universe, and it goes as follows. My friend went to Nicaragua and learned a different kind of weather. She can't live away from a certain season, the season of her love. She knows the inexistence of Latin America. It is of Indian America that we spoke. 500 years of Spanish Inquisition did not crush the language of the wind. When I was wondering the other day what I could say as an introduction, Simone said, just be personal. And so I'll end on a personal note, and the most personal thing I could do is invite my own daughter, who was a good friend of Etel's, to come and sing something for her and for us. If Safira can come. And I should say, she will sing 2 songs and play the oud and sing 2 songs in Arabic. They're both songs composed by Muhammad Abdul Wahab, an Egyptian composer. The first one will be An-Nahr al-Khalid, and the second one will be Ya Musafir Wahdak.
مسافر زاده الخيال، مسافر زاده الخيال، والسحر والعطر والظلال، ظمآن والكأس في يديه، والحب والفن والجمال. شابت على أرضه الليالي، وضيعت عمرها الجبال. شابت على أرضه الليالي، وضيعت عمرها الجبال. ولم يزل ينشد الديار، ولم يزل ينشد الديار، ويسأل الليل والنهار، والناس في حبه سكارى، هاموا على شطه الرحيب، والناس في حبه سكارى، هاموا على شطه الرحيب. آه 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 على سرك الرهيب، وموجك التائه الغريب، يا نيل يا ساحر الغيوب. يا مسافر وحدك وفايتني لتبعد عني لتبعد عني وتشغلني Thank you.
We could call it a day. Or we could call Amel to the stage. Well, Amel, you said you didn't want to go first, so here you go. Another book, actually, that Etel asked me a few times if I had read is Amel's After Jews and Arabs. It was a very important book for Etel. And it's a book from, is it 92, 93? Early 90s. Amel Al-Khalai is a poet, a novelist, an essayist, a critic, a scholar. He's published over 20 books. I'm not going to list the titles, but After Jews and Arabs is one, Memories of Our Future. I just want to mention the new book, the new / forthcoming, stuck on some ship coming from Lithuania, the printer's book titled Controlled Demolition, a work in 4 books, coming out with Litmus Press any day now. I should also mention that he co-translated with Khalid El-Hilli and M. Nazral a collection of poems by Palestinian poet from Gaza, Nasser Rabah. The book is called Gaza, The Poem Said Its Piece, and it's going to come out very soon from City Lights Books in April. And also that Amel is the founder and general editor of Lost and Found, the CUNY Poetics Document Initiative, and you should look for it. It has a website, and you can order all the little pamphlets that come as series every year. That is part of the expansive work of archiving and recovery that has been part of his career. Amel, looking forward to hearing you.
I'll just say it's an honor to follow Safira because, that she can channel Abdul Wahab like that means not only is there hope, it's beyond. It's beautiful. So before I just will say a couple of things before I, read what I wrote. When Simone said that, how is the sound on this? Is it, yeah? When Simone said that Etel is not being read, I think one of the problems, which will take a lot of fixing, is that Etel is really at heart a revolutionary poet, and that's hard to swallow for this culture. And there's all kinds of things I wanted to mention, but I just gathered things that have been on my mind. And but I mean, to think of her figures of Mayakovsky and Dostoevsky and Al-Ghazali, at cafes in Beirut and those kinds of things, her surrealistic bent, all of these things are things that go against the grain of this, neoliberal poetics that exists in this country. Anyhow, rant over. The title is from something Etel wrote about me, so I'm throwing it back at her. Homage to Etel, to begin another poetics. Preface. From Jebu. Palestine is a land planted by eyes refusing to be closed. Jerusalem is not the city of David. Jerusalem is the city of Jebu. There is a poetics in the particular circumstances of Etel's life and work that we have yet to fully describe, but it is a collective project, I think, that will provide essential sustenance through this alarming and desperate time as the hysteria of the hegemon and all its satellites rises to fever pitch while they watch the tide of the world finally break and definitively move away. As we witness truly epic acts of resilience and humanity in the face of destruction and evil undertaken through unprecedented means, our turning away here is not an option, and Etel's hand reaches toward us. I'm just trying to add my voice with what I know and have experienced to the many others who feel and understand what we are up against in similar ways. 1. Response. In August 2014, towards the end of yet another murderous assault on Gaza, I wrote a poem called Letter to the Americans, to which Etel responded, "How to say it, for it makes me cry, to say how much your poem during the last Gaza days goes beyond poems, in the deep heart of poetry, in the heart of human sorrow, renewed throughout centuries. And here you feel it and say it, and I wanted you to know what I'm telling you. Much, much love, Etel." 2. Echo. In June of last year, I wrote a poem called My Apologies, after Bulund al-Haidari, the great Iraqi poet, as an echo of one of my favorite poems, his My Apologies. I wish I could have read this poem to Etel, but I also would not have wanted her to know of the circumstances in which it was written, though she would have understood them all too well. My Apologies, after Bulund al-Haidari. To the hostages of our policies, my apologies. The petty stenographers of the crooked rulers in the once fancy, now crumbling cities of our fading empire lied then. They lied then and they lie now. Everything they say and write is a lie about law and freedom, about equality and justice. In the rubble of the bombs we make and sell, in the silent cries of limbless orphans, in the night lit by white phosphorus and the relentless sound of buzzing drones. They tell us we used to have things of value, even things we ourselves made, and that it was a place like no other. All I know is that Sinbad once sailed to Gaza, and so to Gaza he'll sail once more. 3. Postcard. While gathering books to prepare for this, I found a postcard from Etel tucked into Insomnia. With all that's going on, these pages look so out of touch with reality, but I think that sleepless nights spit out our anguish in clearer ways than it's usual. Anyway, I send them to you. Like an Xmas tree performed a week or more ago was really well received. Taking place in the Gulf War, it interested people. The news makes us desperate. What could have been of the, quote, Middle East, unquote, is a paradise lost. We are running away from it. I'm heartbroken. You must be too. 4. Sanctions. In Joy Gordon's Invisible War, the United States and the Iraq Sanctions, she writes, "In this chapter, I'm not interested in those measures that were particularly petty or ridiculous, or those that caused inconvenience or discomfort or marginally worsened poverty or caused illness or even caused tens or hundreds of deaths. What I want to explore now is the question of how a human catastrophe of this magnitude came about, what the policies and practices were that caused hundreds of thousands of deaths. These things do not come from blocking shipments of glue and laundry detergent, or even from building useless palaces." 5. To be. In To Be in a Time of War, Etel writes, "To know that when it's nighttime here, it's early morning in Baghdad. To think of Badr Shakra Sayyab, to descend into his tomb to inform him that Basra is being destroyed. To wash blood off its people's faces. To leave Badr to his sleep. To fly back to New York, the indifferent, the wounded. To remember Inanna's poems, to call Babylon's gods, to wish that they join the fight and know that that won't happen, to foresee vengeance in death." 6. Books. With no direct colonial presence in the Arab world, very little Arab literature made its way to American publishers. That would take the oil crisis, getting off the gold standard, wars of regime change, and the pressure of Palestine wearing down the liberal Zionist stronghold of U.S. publishing. In the late 1950s to 1960s, there was a trickle of work from Algeria, most of it now out of print, along with some other Francophone writers like Albert Kosseri, Albert Memmi, and a few others. Then another trickle of those writing in Arabic before the mid-70s, some Mahfouz, A Season of Migration to the North, Sonala's The Smell of It, early versions of Adonis, Yusuf Idris. Three Continents Press established itself in 1973. Men in the Sun came out in 1975, and Issa Boulata's Modern Arab Poets, 1950 to 1975. But many of the books were UK only and hard to find. There is a special issue of Mundus Artium in 1977 with Etel's In the Heart of Another Country and many of Sargon's translations. Issa Boulata's brother, our dear departed friend Kamal, edited Women of the Fertile Crescent, which came out in 1980 and had Etel's Jebu in it, a poem that appeared previously in Sargon's one-off magazine Tigris in 1969, in which we reprinted in a facsimile edition in 2024 to accompany Khaled Al-Hili's Lost and Found project, This Great River, translating the beats into Arabic, a selection of excerpts from interviews with Sargon Boulos. In 1980, Salma Jayusi established Prota, Project of Translation from Arabic, and that was followed by Post Apollo in 1982, and Interlink, established in 1987. I read whatever I could get my hands on in English and French, some in Spanish, eventually the continual struggle with Arabic, and always tried to stop in London en route elsewhere whenever I could, because you could go to Al-Saki and other bookshops where more was available. In an important recent book on the literary culture of Beirut, I was disappointed but not surprised to see only one cursory mention of Etel as an artist, and only in reference to a poem of hers that Adonis had translated. And yet, throughout, whether in just a mention or a full portrait, as in her loving and harrowing account of Bulund al-Haidari, Etel's in Master of the Eclipse, Etel's writing has been the main and sometimes only conduit through which the excitement of the presence of poets from that part of the world came across more intimately, giving some sense of these great poets as poets and people, not examples of something else. 7, Antenna. Somewhere as a teenager in Boston, I'd found a copy of Etel's first book, Moonshots, an oversized book with striking color plates, printed in the manner of its time, 1966, à Beirut. Rereading it now, I'm struck by a stanza coming near the end. I told you, I am the antenna of my race, standing at the opening of space, looking at the beginning of the moon. When I found Moonshots, I had already been granted my first degree, summa cum laude, by the poet Vincent Ferrini from his frame shop at 126 East Main Street in Gloucester, Massachusetts, for having read Ezra Pound's ABCs of Reading. 8, movies. My grandfather took me to see Lawrence of Arabia. I think I was 8 years old. He was an officer in World War I from what was then the Kingdom of Serbia. I never met his wife, my grandmother, as she died in Palestine and was buried near Sheikh Badr, a village that was destroyed by the Haganah in 1948, and across from which I lived for some years in the 1980s, in the Tin Quarter, a neighborhood mainly settled by people from Urfa, once called Edessa. They worked as street cleaners, shepherds, construction workers, stone cutters, and peddlers. From the movie, I mainly remembered the light through the brush and the sense of speed in the first scene on the motorcycle. 9, family. My mother and father both left their homes with what they could carry. Though many family members who were left behind got killed in various ways, in the scheme of things, my parents were quite lucky. My ex-in-laws found themselves barefoot in the mountains with guns fighting invaders. They too, in their own way, were quite lucky. 10, Italy. The people who had become my parents and some of the remnants of their respective families made their way to Rome towards the end of April 1945. Just a week or so later, 2 petty criminals captured Ezra Pound at gunpoint, most likely for bounty, from the house at San Ambrogio near Rapallo. Not knowing what his fate might be, he slipped a copy of the Confucian classics and a small Chinese dictionary into his pocket. He ended up at U.S. counterintelligence headquarters in Genoa, where he remained for about 3 weeks. Acting on orders cabled from Washington, he was transferred to the U.S. Army's Disciplinary Training Center, just north of Pisa, where some 3,600 military prisoners, mostly African American, including Emmett Till's father, depicted in an extraordinary new book by John Edgar Wiedemann, were interred. The only civilian inmate, Pound was put in one of the camp's death cells, a 6-by-6-foot steel cage open to the elements, which had been specially reinforced the night before his arrival with sections of heavy airstrip steel mesh, usually used to lay down temporary runways. Pound would end up incarcerated at St. Elizabeth's Hospital for the Mentally Insane, a building that would later become the headquarters of Homeland Security after 9/11, until his release in 1958. But it was in the cage at Pisa where he wrote in one of the cantos, quote, "The raft broke and the waters went over me," unquote. 11, Cold War. Just as Pound was being taken to Pisa, Reinhard Gehlen, Hitler's most senior intelligence officer on the Eastern Front, surrendered to an American counterintelligence corps team. By August, Gehlen was in Washington launching a new phase of his career. Much of what he brought to the table was derived from his role in the torture, interrogation, and murder by starvation of some 4 million Soviet prisoners of war. Dozens and dozens of other such figures were processed in a similar manner, shipped to Washington, then for debriefing at Fort Hunt, otherwise known as Box 1142, before getting further involved in various operations that largely determined U.S. Cold War policy. These included Apple Pie, Birchwood, Bloodstone, Credulity, Dwindle, Lithia, Ohio, Overcoat, Pajamas, Panhandle, Paperclip, Rusty, and Sunrise. 12, Propaganda. The classic formulation by Edward Bernays from 1928 stated that the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. This principle was expanded by Walter Lippmann and others and continually aided by technology. From radio and IBM punch cards used by the Nazi regime to track prisoners in deportations, to television and the Phoenix program in Vietnam, setting the stage for human terrain systems used by the US in Iraq, and the kind of total surveillance and laboratory conditions for weapons testing and behavioral experimentation that Israeli occupation forces have used in Gaza for many years. 13, data. In Surveillance Capitalism, Shoshana Zuboff writes about digital technologies, quote, kidnapping human experience, cornering surplus supplies, and competing in new behavioral futures markets. What is at stake here is the human expectation of sovereignty over one's own life and authorship of one's own experience, unquote. As important as her conclusions are, they remain bound to assumptions of individualism and ownership, far removed from the use of artificial intelligence programs like Lavender, The Gospel, and Where's Daddy, in which the Israeli military created tens of thousands of human Palestinian targets with the intention of killing as many people as possible as quickly as they could. 14, treasure. When my friend and former student Marine Cornuet was finally granted access by Laurent Melki to his mother, the Algerian poet Anna Grecki's trunk of notebooks and papers, one of the things Marine found was a manifesto-like document that described how Grecki would circulate any new poem she wrote to her imprisoned comrades, to see if they had anything to add or amend. Thus, her collection, Algeria, Capital Algiers, written while she was detained and tortured by French occupation forces from March 1957 to December 1958, is actually a collective work. In the preface I wrote, I pointed out that although written in French, Algeria, Capital Algiers, belongs to Arab prison literature. Likewise, Etel's poetics moved through the whole cataclysm of the 20th century, with the end of empires and most forms of colonialism, while still rooted in the legacies of Arabic, French, and English writing and poetics. 15, witness. Walid Daka, martyred on April 7, 2024, in his 37th year of Zionist captivity, once described time as the chisel upon the canvas of place. Let me repeat that. Time as the chisel upon the canvas of place, reflecting the self and collective consciousness. 16, the real. In time, Etel writes, our survival depends on the capacity of the real to escape the assault of language. Our survival depends on the capacity of the real to escape the assault of language. 17, vocabulary. When our dear mutual friend Ben Hollander was dying, George Albon paid him a visit in the hospital. Lying on a gurney, Ben motioned to George when he saw him enter, beckoning him to come closer. As George got closer, Ben pointed to his mouth and George's ear, bringing them closer together. Finally, Ben whispered into George's ear, "My vocabulary did this to me." The staff apparently was quite perplexed at the paroxysms of laughter that followed. 18. Speaking and writing. In his last lectures, delivered in 1969, just prior to a stroke and the onset of aphasia in which he lost the ability to speak, the great linguist Emil Benvenisti, born in Aleppo in 1902, spoke of inner language. Quote, "Inner language is rapid, incoherent, because one always understands oneself. It is always a situated language. But it is a considerable task to transfer this inner language, conditioned by the relation of the speaker with himself, within a unique changing experience and circumstance, into a form intelligible to others, and losing in its written aspect any natural relationship with what occasioned the inner language." In another lecture, Benvenisti said, "The primary system, voice, mouth, ear, is relayed by the secondary system, hand, inscription, eye. The hand plays the role of emitter when tracing letters, and the eye becomes receiver when collecting the written traces." Finally, in his monumental Dictionary of Indo-European Concepts and Society, he wrote, "For a sign to achieve its validation, it is sufficient that it is recognized and perceived as identical. Speech, on the contrary, which implies a novel enunciation each time, must be understood." 19. Poetics. The more I think about this in Etel's particular circumstances, with spoken Greek and Turkish in the house increasingly overtaken by colonial French and the eventual choice of American English and painting in Arabic, the more I feel these great principles espoused by Benvenisti can help guide us further in establishing some deeper terms for Etel's poetics. 20. Other last lectures. In Charles Olson's last lectures, also delivered in 1969, just months before his death, Olson dwelt on Ibn Arabi and the need, quote, "to retard eternity, walking to meet the angel of your own being, walking backwards until you pass through and become yourself. You've got to lose your identity, precarity. You've got to fall back into the world," unquote. Captured by fragmentary student notes, these late life meditations bring us even closer to a poetics. Quote, "The fundamentum of language is being able to imagine words inside. It's a matter of discovering language in yourself, of hearing the words inside." And in the last words of the last lecture, the students transmit this message. Quote, "If you condition yourself to approach the mythology, poetry, in words and letters and alphabets and the materials on which they are inscribed, like you would a tree or a rock or a god, then you will have directed yourself toward the future." Unquote. With Olson dead at 60 and Benvenisti effectively unable to continue working at 67, both felt they had much more to do. And yet, Sila Abdel Kader froze to death in Gaza a few days ago at the age of 6 weeks because the Israelis refused to comply with the terms of an agreement they themselves signed, and no one is willing to use the means readily available to force them into compliance. Sila was preceded to this frozen death by Aisha al-Qassas, 21 days old, Ali Assam Sakr, 23 days old, Ali Hussam Azam, 4 days old, Sila Mahmoud al-Fasih, 14 days old, and Juma al-Batran, 4 weeks old. 21. In the heart of another country. After borrowing Etel's book from Omar on Wednesday, since I couldn't find my copy, I realized I'd written the blurb. Quote, "As the New World Order continues to rewrite our history, mainstream literary culture invades our consciousness to finally sever us from reality. Steadfast in her adherence to the world, Etel Adnan's work is a mix of prose, poetry, political insight, philosophic speculation, and historical remembrance honed here to mineral perfection. Working close to the heart of American poetic power, Adnan has been delivering the news for decades, her eyes always focused on, quote from her, the narrow and long road that leads to the slaughterhouse," unquote. Coda, 22. The library is burning. Towards the end of To Be in a Time of War, Etel writes, "To wait for the unknown, to not know that Baghdad's National Library has been destroyed, to resent the new barbarians, to bleed for each book, to never be able to read one of those books, to plunge into one's veins, to hide into one's brain, to preside over the loss, to observe real endings, to wipe tears, to discover inner tears which turn into wounds, to explore new diseases, to immure oneself to loss, to wallow in dead civilizations, to become one, to bump into the dead, to vomit one's stomach and spit out the heart, to amputate one's head, to agonize on Baghdad's soil, to invoke heat as a weapon, to drink with Michael McClure the blood turned into wine of the Arabs. 23. The library is in the rubble. Hamza Abu Toha, one of my friend Mossab's brothers, saw his library of thousands of volumes of extremely rare Arabic books destroyed in Beit Lahia, northern Gaza, by Israeli bombardment. Likewise, the libraries Mossab had imagined and created, named the Edward Said Libraries, partially stocked with books he recovered from the bombing of his own university in 2014, were also destroyed by Israeli bombardment. With his friend Maruf al-Ashkar, later martyred, Hamza lovingly searched amongst the rubble for volumes that could be spared, and recently sent out a photograph of hundreds of recovered books that had been cleaned and stacked along a wall. On January 28th, Hamza put out a call for people to send books to friends in Cairo in order to rebuild the library, with a request that each person sign their name with a dedication on the books they were able to donate, so he could recognize them in his prayers. Thank you.
Thank you, Amel. We can take like a few seconds to ingest. And we also need to change something in the setup before we can welcome Seretta and Aika to the stage. And I forgot to say earlier that so the symposium, we expressly, and Simone expressly for sure, didn't want to organize it, you know, like those academic symposia that have panels and there's a theme and there's a very short duration and everything is you know, forced. So all of the talks and performances are their own talks and performances. They're not organized in a strict way, thematically or anything. But we would like to take time to discuss and have conversations. So every few talks we'll have a Q&A session, or every 2 talks or something like that. So after Seretta and Aika, we'll have some time if you have questions for either Amel or for them, or if they have questions for each other, or if somebody has something to say. And after that Q&A, we'll have a coffee break. Seretta Morgan is a writer whose work considers the ecologies and intimacies that form in the wake of US militarism. Over the past decade, she has worked alongside No More Deaths Phoenix, Black Lives Matter Phoenix Metro, Mariposas Sin Fronteras, About Face, Veterans Against the War, and other organizations. She's the author of the poetry collection Alt Nature that came out last year with Coffee House Books. And she has also produced interactive multimedia experiences where she opens textual engagements to interrogations of physical space and social configurations. When I invited Seretta to participate in the symposium, knowing that she had an engagement with Etel's work, that she had been reading Etel and wanting to know more about what she read in Etel, she proposed inviting Aika along. Aika Saragat's work attends to the body as text, text as material, and material as collective practice. Her writing can be found in Apogee, Fence Magazine, Underblong, Nightboat Books blog, and elsewhere. She's a trained crisis counselor and DV's survivor advocate. She founded the Saragat School of Motion and Text, SSMT, in 2022 to create more spaces for dynamic listening, guerrilla poetics, and embodied possibilities. One of the points of the symposium is to hear from voices of people who have known Etel personally, people who have studied her work for a long time, but also people who are not necessarily already associated to her name, because this family needs to grow. And I'm very excited to hear Seretta and Aika.
Are we in danger with them?
They should be close.
Okay, cool.
That's cute. Better, the closer the better.
Great. How about that?
That's gonna.
Okay, thank you.
Hello. Hi. Thank you, Omar and Simone, for gathering us. And thank you, Giorno Poetry Systems and Poetry Project and the staff, including facilities, for making this possible and housing us. Salamat, friends and family, for being here. And thank you, Etel, for teaching all of us, and happy birthday.
I want to say one thing before I get started, which is thank you to Amel and to Zafira for placing us all in this very generous context. Also, just a little bit about the talk that we're going to share is that when we decided to do this together, Aika and I thought about some questions that felt very dear to our hearts, and we took those to different spaces of Etel's work, and then kind of looked out and saw where she was leading us from there. Does that sound correct?
Sounds wonderful.
Okay.
Correct enough.
A small lighthouse, people the size of colored beetles walking upright. In one of her last public interviews, sitting in a chair near the sea, Etel described the experience of watching clouds pass in front of the sun.
It's as if somebody put off a light and everything changes. So you realize that we are in a constant change and turmoil. There is no total rest, not only for us, but for the world.
Silence is the sound of the world changing, of perception dimming as the unforeseeable crawls its way into a familiar range. In bed, my head was in Aika's lap. It was late December, both of us jet-lagged. She read to me from fog.
Waking in the countryside, element of one's memory, one feels the spirit's weight. Still, the night sky. We travelers breathe an archaic fire's residue.
I drew a shape with my finger in the air. It was a rhythm rising and then not, somehow without receding, without abruption, gone.
How does this lead me to silence? What does it mean to join? In music, silences are like notes. I'm not only talking about rests. Quieting a sound requires proper pressure, correct contact, critical to tone, texture. Gaps in sound can perform negative space, but are not necessarily negative space. In fighting, pauses lead to strikes, and strikes create pauses, which can create negative space for somebody's cadence to land. To read this, one must be in rhythm within moment.
In song.
If the land feels still, we're in motion.
Etel from The Enemy's Testament.
My body I leave to the Mekong River.
It's true that all rivers eventually become the sea, but not in our lifetime. One of my most comforting thoughts is that human existence on Earth will, when it ends, be so little in comparison to geologic time. I hope we feel as brief to her as all the stratigraphic scales suggest. Aika surfing, sandpipers being sandpipers in response to waves doing what waves do. I stood in front of the ocean, asked, how do I learn to listen?
Aika surfing, sandpipers being sandpipers in response to waves doing what waves do. I stood in front of the ocean, asked,
how do I learn to listen?
Over a dinner, and I'm not going to say once because I have likely said this in multiples, I told Seretta that the way she holds her body is like she has a relationship to the ground, a thread, like she's tending to it connectively, a particular center of gravity, not to defy or reinvent it, but to become it.
Contain it.
Movement and stillness appear the same when looking is focused on a point. Hips loose, ideally, with a muscled neck. Rarely stiff. Strong enough to just lift. Silence is the sound of the world changing.
From Jebu.
Palestine is a land planted by eyes refusing to be closed.
From Jebu.
Jebu shall return to distribute the land to the land.
Land is a strategy, watching, breathing in anticipation, sensitive to the continuation of assaults, to the misuse of fire and bread. Her warriors folded into the terrain, devoted beneath foliage. Sensitive to rhythms and let them feed in their silences, she is preparing them to rise. Etel in 2015, standing in front of her writing desk.
You know, we think we progress, but we don't progress. We change.
That same day on the war in Yemen.
They bomb the civilians, and what do we see? The president of France going to Riyadh, having his picture taken with the people of this coalition and selling them the most sophisticated airplanes. And the consequence of that image is never explained.
In 2025, the United States is still providing weapons manufactured in this country for the slaughter of Palestinians. Indigenous peoples in this country are attacked with bullets and with dogs for protecting their lands. Consequences of the United States' role in genocide have been clearly, thoroughly, peacefully explained.
When does the force of the land become illegible, obscure? How do our bodies certify illegibility? The antiverse asserts itself in a feint. Etel in surge.
The real is home, assuredly, and is also reverberating within reality.
A truth protects truth. A punch covers a kick. A line permits a word. Red paint permits another green. Each of these represents poetics well played. Actually, attention. The antiverse as a backbeat, sometimes a blue note that's almost or so much, simply not quite. A silent counter.
Reverberating.
After I said what I said and we finished eating, sitting on the floor across from one another, a clear acrylic table dividing us, I pointed down to the angles of Seretta's wrist, then at her elbow, supporting her shoulder, supporting the weight of her leaning body. A precise folding, so aware of itself, I said, like you're threaded to the ground.
If the terrain faints, what moves? Who bites?
When we fall into the seduction of anticipation, we are in our own wanting, alone, finding our movements offbeat. And once in the land's wanting, on. From Concerning Violence, minute 43, 26 seconds, the women pounding food in an open landscape, Lauryn Hill voicing Fanon.
The native intellectual had learnt from his master that the individual must ought to express himself fully.
In looking, I realized she shows me how to stand.
Etel in 2015 in her home studio.
You know, we think we progress, but we do not progress. We change.
Frantz Fanon's essay on resistance and liberation concerning violence provides the philosophical context for Johan Olsen's 2014 documentary of the same name, Concerning Violence, 9 scenes from the anti-imperialistic self-defense. Fanon's lines, voiced by rapper and activist Lauryn Hill, overlay documentary footage of decolonial movements for independence in colonial Africa in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. European soldiers shooting from their aircraft into fields of cattle so that their heads bleed quietly into the grass, and other poetically cinematized images of war. Etel in 1972, on the nature of images in news coverage on the resistance war against America in Vietnam, from Television and War.
Planes dropping giant shells that form gigantic black flowers on the ground,
Becoming
the sole commodity that remains fascinating because it is embroiled in a game of life and death.
a loop of abstractions. Lauryn Hill as Fanon at minute 42 and 24 seconds. For a colonized people, the most essential value, because it is the most concrete, is first and foremost the land that will bring them bread and, above all, dignity. Looking into the future via Concerning Violence in 1962, Portuguese soldiers in Mozambique terrorized from the sky in NATO-supplied airplanes. On land, they last less than 2 weeks against the Organized Front for Liberation. The land is a strategy.
A fighter feels. In that feeling, thoughts, while beaten, in beating, muscles twitch as response. Etel.
Instinct is a way of thinking.
Landscapes open reactively. Even at rest, a muscle works, holds, in approximate organs doing, sensing interoceptively as trees measure distance from one another organically. Etel. Of course you think, but you don't think in obvious ways.
Something thinks in you.
Every syllable has a range. Touch, no touch, touch, no touch, no hand in my hand, a strike on my nose, a head on a thigh, absence around my neck, knees to the floating ribs, no touch, no, touch, touch, no, touch, no touch, an ocean lifting my back, sweat on my lashes blinking, touch, touch.
Does it matter that my most memorable moments in thinking toward this talk occurred in the bed or in the shower?
That's a rhetorical question.
What I feel when I experience Etel, whom I never met in person, is a feeling of humility in the face of existence so vast, but also of sharpening, moving toward sharpness that is an ability to slip in and out of time. In February, we were in bed with my hand between Aika's thighs. She reads from Fog.
The desert is an open uranium pile. Deliriums, mushrooming, you will contemplate death, says the book of Revelation.
Deserts structure water. There's power in choosing how I offer attention to the bodies that think with me. In the desert, we said, I love you. Watched shade pass over rocks. Fucked in a canyon outside Tucson, then cooked a marvelous fish. We took mushrooms but did not think about death. So present and tender. That was the revelation. Eating oranges, we wept on the floor. From Fog.
I'm turning around a fire that burns the way water runs. Finding, according to Adnan's poetics, language like color is an extension of desire, which is an extension of instinct,
Which is an extension of animal, which is an extension of land.
which is an extension of need. Etel. We should remember how important the material you use influences what you do. They collaborate with you. So it's wonderful to be sensitive to not only what you are doing, but
What the material makes you do.
fullness of feeling, not absence, begets desire, where in the sense that material resolution led Etel toward a red square, a red press. Poets in the room, many of us, can be too often too susceptible to the abstractness of metaphor, forgetting that metaphors only work when materials exist. This passive memory is costing us our lives. In a New York Newsday interview, Kamal Brathwaite notes,
The green is disappearing. I don't know how the younger generation will write poetry which is unique to Barbados if it's only concrete and gas they're looking at.
a red shape, Etel's painted signal for conclusion, others revolution, equally material. Revolving thought. Fullness of expression or finishedness of expression in the face of an enemy
often hidden from view,
does not equate to the fullness of visibility nor visible resolution. Protective measures rarely gesture in clarity, if anything, a clear jest. Trin ti min ha. To write clearly, one must incessantly prune, eliminate, forbid, purge, purify. Other words, practice an ablution of language. Clarity and directness function as two different weapons. One has a stem, the other an arrow. Whose hands are gripping? How thick the wrap? Etel.
all the muscles participate in making art, in thinking, the decision-making.
No joke.
Down low, breathing with my whole chest, sensitive to another body and anticipating a familiar sensation I don't call pain. I feel connected and in reverence, maybe close to what Aika means when she says,
Devotion.
my capoeira teacher, Mr. Anderson, says, inviting the ancestors to rise. The first thing he taught me before movement or stance was a song about rivers that run to the sea. In this song, the choir returns with rivers in their mouths. Regardless of where they end, all rivers are listening for the sea. Etel in 2015.
Of course you think, but you don't think in obvious ways. Something thinks in you.
Devotion is listening, thinking, from a river toward the sea.
Of course. A phrase commonly meaning something like obviously, or no problem, or you're welcome. But when I say of course I'm a fighter, I mean I am of the course that my homelands have been burned, bombed, and scarred by woefully inattentive and greedy beings, that it is, of course, that what I know deeply is to fight and cry. A poetics facing its material facing it. In an interview from 2015, before proceeding to talk about the manipulation of visual art on television and the level of descriptive violence that often does not share its explicit consequences, Etel comments how
the world is unnecessarily tense.
I feel such tension when I want to be soft in bed, yet every fiber that composes my flesh seeks sharper action. A drop facing its ocean. Is it always unnecessary?
The tension.
And why did I say yet? Conjoined with the terrain at all times, the poetics of guerrilla, its heart obscure only to the conquering, otherwise a pulse legible to the deeply listening, feeling enough, skin to earth skin. Ernesto Che Guevara from Guerrilla Warfare. The guerrilla fighter needs to have a good knowledge of the surrounding countryside, the paths of entry and escape, the possibilities of speedy maneuver, good hiding places. The guerrilla fighter is above all an agrarian revolutionary. If artist with earth material, the work is responding to the matter's wants. What this material wants me to do, entirely that. The guerrilla is like a poet, writes Jose Maria Sison.
And rhymed with nature, the subtle rhythm of the greenery, the inner silence, the outer innocence, the steel tensile and grace that ensnares the enemy.
The matter's wants. If artist with earth material, the work is responding
to the matter's wants.
I am armed with the facilities to love.
What the guerrilla knows. Even when what is materially obvious appears most urgent and in range, attention to expressions of silence, to the world changing, provides the most consequential overstanding. The entirety of global suffering is already within our awareness, influencing our rhythm. As a consequence, thinking rises always in what is stepped on in our estimated 0.007% of geographic time. what this material wants me to do. Entirely that. Our thinking is hardly perceptible. Our thinking is hardly perceptible. Our thinking is hardly perceptible. Aika says that before she imagines an opponent, she finds a rhythm. In 1960s Mozambique, soldiers form lines to create a rhythm with drums between their knees and rifles across their backs. Before any capoeirista faces another, there is music, songs and songs of it, inviting the ancestors to rise. Dear Etel, thank you for seeing into the thick of wickedness and dedicating yourself still to beauty, beauty to mark the celebrations, exploding the minutes and seconds and hanging before us the mutilation of time.
For lifting the voice of martyrdom and revolution that must, at this point, rise in every land.
Naming the men who say nothing.
For your infiltrations and ghostings of consciousness, pulling the veil off of all violent jokes. Beauty that tends to the only true fire. Forgoing footing, but never the practice of sight.
For precision of the ages, calling each veil by its already mutating name. From fog.
In certain areas of the world, countries are made to explode by remote control. It used to be said by divine will. It was easier to resist God's decisions than today's superpowers.
What sound rises from my will toward that which is divine? Form is the material of life, a meditation on living in relationship to particular terrains. Touch, no touch, touch, no touch, no touch, 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 no. Actual violence is concealed. In certain areas of the world, things happen only in other areas of the world. From a night in February, touching and wine.
Material. To know it without knowing it, see, sans seen, because no sight will ever do, lest, in the pit, groove, dug in earth, a knuckle pressing through fascia. Finding the pocket requires sitting in it, waiting, devoted. From Journey to Manta Malpais.
We have in us autonomous language for autonomous perceptions.
From Fog.
The sea is breathing, splashing, unconcerned, but a heart is fainting.
The brain's hemispheres are receiving different lights in the silence. What does it mean to belong to a land? For those of us who live away from our private history,
the question never heals.
This reality, arrhythmic, the ante, incessant, aligned verse, coming to the call. Larry Itliong, a necessarily funny man with a buzz cut and a persistent cigar. Strike organizer, Filipino labor leader, grape elder. I'm gonna be frank with you. I have all kinds of guts, you know. I'm not scared of nobody. When the Delano Manongs decided to strike, land owners retaliated by cutting off vital resources in the already deplorable labor camps. No gas, no lights, no water, no food. A strike as an extension of withdrawal, an extension of war, an extension of necessity, an extension of body.
Land again.
Huelga, 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 huelga. Isang bagsak. Like language, land will exhaust. In caring for it, you tire. In working it, you tire. Something will say, enough. Concerning violence, minute 51, 20 seconds to 48 seconds.
Women explaining why they went into the bush and asserting commitment to the Frelimo.
Make them believe you are never done.
Mozambican men and women withdrew into the bush to strategize defense. From a dark-skinned, intricately tattooed woman, her words are translated. The revolution is moving forward and we will not return to the past. our eyes are open. Audio of two women singing in low voices runs over footage of soldiers trekking through red water, supplies balanced on their heads. Another woman having her hair braided beneath palms, she says, "We peacefully asked for our independence, but they didn't care. They massacred us." And later, "We fled to the bush and took up guns because of the actions of colonialism. I am ready, and I am part of the guerrilla." These women are still and quiet beneath the foliage when planes circle overhead.
Note, for me to write, and likely won't, how IDF soldiers in Shirgao talked about cheap living in Southeast Asia, how we shared a van from the airport, how I kept seeing them everywhere, how I watched one throw trash on the beach while her shirt read
Paradise.
how it's been XXX days since I was in an ocean, how I'm never going to make meaningful income off of poems, how Israelis in Pai, Thailand are upsetting locals to the point of inciting deportation, and how punishment-obsessed, land-grabbing military persons are exploiting communities and means of defense, as in dignity, as in earth sovereignty, how histories of terrain draw the line between combat sport and martial art, how I want to go home and there will always be a cost. Etel.
My body I leave to the Mekong River.
The enemy's testament. Slow technicality, slow training. It's going to require my whole life.
Etel in 2015, holding a postcard of a mountain in Mexico.
You know, we think we progress, but we don't progress. We change.
The 2009 Afro-Brazilian martial arts film, Besouro, is an action drama set in 1920s Brazil, 40 years after the abolition of slavery. The film's protagonist, Besouro, is a skilled capoeirista and revolutionary fighting to liberate his people from their Portuguese diasporic employers, who exploit their labor on plantations through collaboration with local police. Death is what is stepped on by other people, Besouro's mentor assures. Teakum wood sprays our hero's blood across the sand. Looking down from the periphery of a firelit clearing, Besouro watches, helpless, concealed by the jungle, as police torture his comrade and friend, Chico. I stopped the video so I could breathe. Then I let it continue in silence. It's become so normal. Still, it creates a particular pattern on your soul. To look down into a perfectly framed clearing in the woods where there is no sound to see a man being tortured there, and watch.
The second time I read Fog to Seretta, it's night again. We slept through the afternoon, transitioning into evening, and woke to a darker sight. The former hours were imperfect. I was so thankful for her yes. Etel. The Fog's project is to substantiate reality. Mountains occupy inadvertently one's complete consciousness. The gaps between two bodies lessened, approaching a familiar sensation that no longer hurts. Consequently, Etel. The sea retires into the distance. I felt every pause. When there was an urge to open my mouth, only air passed through my lips. Change came after us. I paused longer.
Then we let it.
Pain, pleasure, laughter, exhaustion. The thinking reached once fully fatigued of thoughts. Something like clarity, not a non-sensation, but a sensation inside sensation. Inside the ring, controlling the range. Somehow it's absolutely me. In Muay Thai, a fighter's heart is fortified sharply and proven best, often after exhaustion, when sources are perceivably lost. The what remains. Exactly what? Known body. Something illegible until.
From A Dead-End Situation in Edouard Licent's Caribbean Discourse. For the attempt to approach a reality so often hidden from view cannot be organized in terms of a series of clarifications.
The flurry, a singular hit composed of singular hits with felt measure. How to read this dialectic? In the thighs, on foot, playing, back weight, front ready, cadence, 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 bush. Where is the place of insurrection at my most intimate points? What can intimacy tell me when insurgency emerges in my body? Whose rhythm? In a journal passage from 1967, on the day of my birth, March 13, Etel Adnan wrote,
Today, all the memories of the universe, as universe, and I became one in front of the mountain.
How does the ground rise?
From fog.
To take pleasure in the void is an operation of erasure, a denial of the ocean's power, or one's preparation for the time when ocean will engulf all that there is.
Landscapes open reactively, a precise folding so aware of itself, and far-off wars, conjoined with cadence.
Cadence, cadence.
Cadence and always the smell of time, of drums between legs. Of course, thinking is hardly perceptible.
A millimeter of devotion toward that which is divine.
When everything is ocean, there will be no airstrips for NATO-supplied airplanes, no pipeline construction, no clearings in the forest, no IDF, no IDF, no IDF.
No IDF. No torture or contempt for the land.
When time is only color and weight to slip into. From what direction will our memory rise?
When everything is ocean, where will be sound?
Thank you.
Salaam.
There is no moderation. Maybe you can take this one.
We can just share this one.
Yeah, we can pass.
Thanks very much to the two of you for such a beautiful, generous, expansive offering. There is no moderation. I mean, I can ask questions, but I don't think that's the point. So I think if either of you has anything to say or to ask or to comment on each other's talk, that's a possible point to start. But there doesn't need to be an order. If there are questions or observations in the room, then we can take them, whatever comes first. And if I have to say something, one thing that struck me, I mean, many things struck me, but one thing is, I wrote this one down. Amel, you said, is that a quote from Etel? Our survival depends on the capacity of the real to escape the assault of language. And for me, that resonated with what you said, Aika, about the lure of abstract metaphor, forgetting its materials. Maybe that's somewhere we can start. This thing is dangerous.
It's because you're in front of the speaker.
You want to?
You switch back.
You can start.
I
Eli.
I don't know. I mean, I don't really have a response to that. So I think it's, self-explanatory. Maybe not at the moment. It takes a lot of thinking through that. So, but I'm, still thinking about it. So, yeah.
I think something that Seretta and I often talk about, and when I talk about with friends who also happen to be writers and practitioners of words, is thinking about a writing practice that does not center writing, and which then, you think about material, about life, the places and preparation, altars we built for thinking, for doing, and understanding the consequences of what we do, not just what are the consequences of this poem, but also what are the consequences of the things that I did so that I can write this poem.
Yeah, I think similar to that, when metaphors are used and there's no thought to what that language means materially in the world, that decontextualization becomes violent. And I think thinking in metaphor, makes sense in some ways, but there has to be a rematerialization, recontextualization, like actively on the part of we who are reproducing language.
And then the other thing to add to that, this is like my teacher moment, but metaphors change because they're so culturally and also environmentally shaped. And so as a teacher, I also just encourage students, say what you're trying to say, and then we'll work from there.
Are there questions or comments from the? Oh, we lost. No.
The matter said no.
Are there questions, comments, thoughts from the very packed audience here? Somebody must have something
I have a
to.
question.
Yeah.
Hi. So I really appreciated the poem. I think my voice is carrying. It's good, right? So I appreciated the poem. I was curious about.
Because we're recording, maybe I'll
Okay.
pass you a mic. The mic won't reach everywhere, but one thing we can do is either we repeat the question after it's asked, or you can come closer.
All right. Well, for the record, my name is Jet. I'm a big fan of Aika's. Hello. I appreciate the poem for many reasons, for its cadence, but I was curious about the function of the dialogue and the role that plays in creating the content. And I'm using content because not in the social media sense, but in thinking about the collaborative nature of speaking to the past, speaking to Etel, and then speaking to one another. So I'm curious, this is an open-ended question, and maybe it's not just about the poem, but I'm curious about how dialogue works as a tool for guerrilla poetry, and how it works as a strategy when thinking through and engaging with language.
For me, a brief and direct answer to that is dialogue demands you to listen. And if you're lucky, the person or thing or place or time on the other end will make sure you do that. And I think that's where one begins, or one should begin in terms of collaboration in the larger sense of that word.
In terms of the role of conversation in producing a guerrilla poetics or guerrilla nature, I think one thing to think about first is that all language is produced in conversation, and I'm thinking right now about Cristina Rivera Garza's work, and just the importance of acknowledging that we get language from other people. We're always thinking and writing through the language of others, and I think one thing about displaying that conversation is just being honest. author, and kind of like pushing back on the idea of like sole authorship. If you're in a relationship, especially with someone who's writing, like writing is always, very consciously happening in our house, in the way that we live together, and the way that we reflect to one another. And I think that's true, like beyond intimate relationships as well. Something I've been thinking about recently is like the structure of like poetry workshops. You like pay and go somewhere and somebody teaches you something, but everyone in that room is reproducing language together. One person's getting paid from it, and their work is like exemplified. And so I think like one thing guerrilla poetics do is just like also explore the material reality that's beneath the production of language, and like how the economic disparity of that is dangerous, is literally, costing people their lives.
Amel, what's the book?
Can I pass you a mic?
Oh, it's very fast. Moon Nights.
Moonshots.
Moonshots.
What is it about?
This is Etel's first book, which I can give you to look at.
Can I look at it?
Yeah, sure.
You can hold it.
But maybe Amiel, you can also say something about it, something more about Moonshots.
I don't know. I mean, maybe Simone can say something more about Moonshots. I don't know. Was it written in French? Moonshots? No, it was written in English. Okay.
Where did you find it?
Somewhere like Temple Bar, or one of those places in Boston.
Found it on the internet, and it's very rare.
Yeah.
Very rare.
Yeah.
I have only one copy.
Well, now we have two. Other.
In this book, she actually she actually wrote this before people were thinking of going to the moon, and she was thinking that the moon was going to lose her virginity, as it is written in the poem, because the moon has always been the metaphor for everything. I want the moon, I want to give you the moon, I want to go to the moon. The moon is among all the other planets, is the one we talk about all the time. And for Etel, planets was very close. This is why she wrote this book. And it is her first publication.
Yeah.
It says these poems are dedicated to the lost virginity of the moon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just to repeat for the live stream, these poems in Moonshots are dedicated to the lost virginity of the moon.
Yeah. Other questions, thoughts?
Yes, Jennifer.
Amiel, there was a quote from Etel about a scalpel and the canvas. Do you remember?
That's Walid Daqqa, who was a political prisoner in Palestine.
I was wondering if you could say it again and say what you think.
Time
that
is a
that is
chisel
getting
on the
at.
canvas of place.
Mm.
So, time is the chisel upon the canvas of place, reflecting the self and collective consciousness. Okay, so, where to start with Walid Daqqa? He conceptualized a very new paradigm for imprisonment in Palestine, and there was the larger prison, and there was the prison that contained the prisoners, and he had this concept of parallel time that took place in these different realms. And in his life and his work and his writing, he was trying to shift the consciousness, I guess, of how people were thinking about things. And he's also one of the not quite sure exactly how many, but there was a movement of prisoners who smuggled sperm out of prison so that they could have children. And Walid Daka was one of those people who did that, and he wrote a series of children's books dedicated to his daughter, Milad, about that, about what he did. So there's a few things you can find in English if you look him up. His writing is extraordinary, and there's a extraordinary piece by a younger Palestinian, Kaleem Hawa, called Emptying the Bag, I think is the title of it. It's a really great piece on Walid Daka that you can find.
How do you understand that quote?
This quote? You tell me. I don't know. It's very striking. You know, it's a very striking thing, and it seemed to me, you know, one doesn't necessarily understand these things particularly, you know, but it does create another way of thinking about things. And that happens a lot with Etel. It's like Omar asking me about the following quote that is a kind of a response in a way from Etel. Our survival depends on the capacity of the real to escape the assault of language. Now, you want me to actually give you an explanation of that? I don't know. It's a formula. It's a precept. It's a paradigm. It's an analogy. It's a way of thinking about anything in the juxtaposition of those figures. You know, not necessarily in the understanding of each part of that sentence, but in its relationship.
Specifically wondering if the chisel is piercing the canvas or working with it.
Well, first of all, it's odd because, you know, why would you use a chisel on canvas? You would use a chisel on stone.
Exactly.
So,
well, you know, maybe in reference to a lot of Palestinian prisoners who escaped were chiseled. There was a group of them who
Susan,
chiseled.
could you speak in?
he also, Walid Daka also did a very elaborate and fine drawings. So
There were a group of Palestinian prisoners who also escaped by chiseling with a spoon out from, one of those, I forget his name, but he was just released too. Zakaria.
Zubaydi.
Zubaydi.
Yeah. From Jenin,
There is coffee, but there is a quota of questions before coffee. We have one at the back. You want to come here, or should I repeat? The question was, didn't Etel use a chisel to paint? It's the technical word is palette knife. Yeah. Looks like it's really time for coffee. Hello? Hello, 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 hello. So this could be a thing that we don't do Q&As and just extended coffee breaks. That's a thing that can work. But I will try again in an hour to do a Q&A session. All right. We'll resume with our next two speakers, Brandon Shimoda and Huda Fakhreddine. Yeah. I mean, one of the great things about organizing something like this is you can use it as an excuse to meet people you've been wanting to meet for a long time. It's the case for me with Brandon. Thank you for agreeing to come and speak here. Brandon Shimoda is the author of several books of poetry and prose. Most recently, The Afterlife is Letting Go, which was just published a few months ago with City Lights, on the memory and forgetting of Japanese-American incarceration, and Hydra Medusa, 2023. He's the co-editor with Bryn Saito of The Gate of Memory, Poems by Descendants of Nikkei Wartime Incarceration, which is forthcoming, right? This year. And the co-editor with Tom Donovan of the 2-volume anthology of Etel's writing, To Look at the Sea is to Become What One Is, an Etel Adnan reader. He lives with his partner, the poet Dot Devoda, and their daughter Yumi in Colorado. And I didn't do it in the previous session, i.e. read the titles of the talks, which are all so beautiful. So belatedly, Amel's talk was called Tenderness for the World as It Is, Journeying into the Present with Etel Adnan. Seretta and Aika's conversational poem talk was called Guerrilla Nature, Tactics of the Ethereal. And Brandon's talk is titled Burn the Walls of Your Own Apparitions, which is a quote from Etel, Burn the Walls of Your Own Apparitions, on Etel Adnan's Hiroshimas. Brandon Shimoda.
Thank you. Beautiful. So much love and thanks to Omar for inviting me. I think you said that I would agreed to do it. I mean, what an incredible honor, of course. And so much love and thanks to Simone, who I feel like we are both surrounding and inside of Etel's heart right now. But seeing you and listening to you, I feel her presence through you. So thank you for everything. I'm going to read something that is directly, well, even though I just experienced what we all experienced, what I'm going to present is directly inspired by Amel's talk. It's directly motivated by Seretta and Aika's talk. And it's empowered by, is it Saphira? Saphira's music, in that order. Sounds okay? And hi to everyone on the live stream. Hi Dot, hi Yumi. I want to share with you a daydream that I have been having for many years. The title of my daydream is, as Omar said, Burn the Walls of Your Own Apparitions, which is from Etel's epic poem of Palestinian resistance, Jebu, which so far has been quoted by everybody. The subject of my daydream is the appearance and the presence in Etel's writing of Hiroshima. The reason I call this a daydream is because even though I think about it all the time, I have only ever thought about it nebulously, with a wandering mind. When Omar invited me to speak here today, my mind went straight to Hiroshima, for reasons I will try to explain, and that maybe do not need to be explained. I want then to bring my daydream down, but only part way, because I want to translate its movements while preserving its heart, and also because the central characteristic of my relationship with Etel's writing is nebulous, with a wandering mind like a daydream. These questions come to me. What is the meaning of Hiroshima in Etel's writing? Why does it appear so often? Why does it appear at all? And more personally, why do I feel so consoled by its appearance? I want to start by contextualizing these questions and by offering my definition, or rather my desire for what is meant to be consoled. To be consoled is for an asylum to be made for your spirit, and for your spirit to recognize and illuminate in that asylum the compassion of those for whom the asylum is an embodiment. I did not have family in Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, nor in Nagasaki 3 days later on August 9th. My paternal grandfather was born in Hiroshima. My great-grandmother was born and raised in Hiroshima. And my great-great-grandfather was born and raised and died in Hiroshima. He died in 1913. My great-grandmother died in 1937. My grandfather was alive in 1945. He had just emerged from the mass incarceration of his people and was living here in New York City. I visited Hiroshima for the first time when I was 10, on my birthday, August 6th, 1988, Hiroshima Day. And I have visited many times since. I have been reading and writing about Hiroshima and Nagasaki for as long as I have been reading and writing. They have appeared in everything I've ever written, including everything that I'm writing now, because I have not gotten over Hiroshima, and neither apparently has the United States. The ways the United States and I have not gotten over Hiroshima are, of course, very different. But because I am an American citizen, I have to accept that part of my perspective and my experience have been underwritten by several terrible delusions, including the delusion that I am not somehow, and however small, a beneficiary, and maybe more directly, the inheritor of the violence that has been committed by the United States, including in the form of the atomic bombs that were shot at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It is time to retire the verb drop to describe what is done with bombs. Bombs do not drop out of planes. Bombs are shot. Planes are guns. This is all to say that my relationship to Hiroshima has less to do with my Japanese ancestry than it does to being a citizen of the nation that reproduced its soullessness in the violence that we have named unjustly, yet acutely, Hiroshima. My daydream starts here. Hiroshima appears and it tells a funeral march for the first cosmonaut. The Indian never had a horse. Seasons, Master of the Eclipse, Celestial City, Night, and Shifting the Silence. It appears in the first of Etel's writings to be published in Arabic translation. The original English version is titled American Roses on the Ruins of Hiroshima, And Omar, just a couple days ago, found a nice, clean copy of the Arabic. And I asked Etel once about it. I think that's what you're referring to. She wrote something, sent it off, and maybe the original just completely disappeared. She, anyway, had no memory of where it went. She remembered writing it. Hiroshima appears spectrally in the form of the atomic bomb in the Arab apocalypse, of course, in a short text on Cézanne titled Immaterial Statements of Matter, and in a letter to Benjamin Hollander, reproduced in Letters for Olson. And it appears twice in Jebu. This is where I first encountered it, in Kamal Balada's 1981 anthology, Women of the Fertile Crescent. Incidentally, Balada, a Palestinian artist, died on August 6th, 2019, Hiroshima Day. It appears early in the poem in a direct address. Jebu, lines of prophets covered you with curses, but you live in their memory and you are the worm gnawing at their bones. You are coming back after the latest of the last, Christ and Mohammed astronaut, carried by the antennas of our radios. You shall burn the walls of your own apparitions, and there shall be a people more fluid than water, more fiery than the coming Hiroshimas. When I first read these lines, I was struck by three things. Three, that Hiroshima was being invoked in a poem about Palestine. Two, that Hiroshima was plural. And one, that Hiroshimas were on the way. It could be understood that coming Hiroshimas means that there are atrocities of Hiroshima-like proportions and intentions to come, which, as we know, has been true, and which, as we fear, will continue to be. But the way I read it is that Hiroshima did not happen in the past, because it is still happening. It is still happening through interrelated offspring atrocities that keep happening, and it is still happening because Hiroshima itself is still happening. For one reason, there are at least 100,000 hibakusha, atomic bomb survivors, still living, whose memory and amnesia, storytelling and silence, activism and illness, and whose children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren are testimonies to the perpetuity of mass violence. It is therefore something that we need to see and understand before us. As I was thinking all of this, Hiroshima appeared again, a few pages later in Jebu, in a stanza that begins with a biblical-like incipit. In the beginning, Jebu had been killed, but his eyes are the Tigris and the Euphrates. His belly is Syria, his penis is the Jordan, his long leg is the Nile Valley, 1 foot in Marrakesh, his bleeding heart encased in Mecca. His hair is still growing on the Sinine. The X-ray of his being on the day of Hiroshima, like a sweat, appeared on the Jerusalem wall. Everything named in this stanza exists in the Arab world, everything except Hiroshima. But that is a limited interpretation of both Hiroshima and the Arab world. It is also a limited interpretation of time and space, because Hiroshima is rooted undeniably in what is being expressed, because Hiroshima, embodying the eruption of a soulless ideology, is being constantly reconfigured and radiated elsewhere and everywhere else. Everything exists for me, everything in Etel's writing exists for me on a cosmological spectrum. On one end is apocalypse. On the other end is also apocalypse. The difference and the distance between is that of the world being revealed and the world revealing itself. Etel's writing reveals the world and lets the world reveal itself. But what is the difference and the distance between? Before I take note of the appearance of Hiroshima in Etel's writing, I want to set my consolation and relief against the bitterness I feel when I encounter Hiroshima elsewhere in other writing, namely, and I'll use Amel's word, neoliberal American poetry, or the majority of it. Hiroshima seems to exist, if it exists at all, as an occasion on which to exercise a kind of witness that enacts what Christina Sharp calls the mirror register of violence. For example, wonder, surprise, and innocence in relation to that violence. For further example, guilt, shame, the heedless, preemptive impulse to empathy, atonement. Hiroshima exists, therefore, as a confessional, in which only the penitent can be seen, or seen clearly, everyone and everything else enshrouded, opaque, and untranslatable. Hiroshima does not, in these ways, come naturally. It is almost always a stepping outside of oneself. It is therefore a pilgrimage, metaphorical and real, therefore a site of reenactment, therefore a site of education, an opportunity to learn. But there is nothing to learn from Hiroshima that we do not already know, that we have not made terrible use or bent irreversibly into ignorance. There is a pathological tendency toward beauty, which is often both exonerative and extractive, modes of relation that blur the space between the poet and their encounter, so that the poet leaves a part of themselves, often in the form of a disintegrated language, and takes part of what they are encountering away with them, like a grave robber. Hiroshima does not exist in Etel's writing in any of these ways. It is not a site of extraction, or exoneration, or beauty, or education, or confession, or witness. It does not exist to transport the reader. It is neither monument nor memorial. It is something more simple, more straightforward, inescapable, like an element, a fact. It comes naturally, without being called, as if from a spring under the ground. I emailed Etel once all of this, ridiculously. I feel like Hiroshima recurs throughout your writing as a reminder, a pulsation, a figure during an intermission, I wrote on June 26, 2015. She replied a few days later. Here is Etel in an email she wrote to me on July 1st, 2015. In 1945, I was 20 and in Beirut. The war had ended with a big bang, so it seemed, and it must have been because of Hiroshima. Some terror had finished the war, a war that for Lebanon represented an economic boom, a participation in adventure. Japan was extremely far from our daily horizon. 10 years later, in Berkeley, I found out the immensity of that event. I saw images of the explosion in Hiroshima, and the mushroom-like white cloud looked to me as a human brain. I learned that the war was already won by the Americans when they dropped the bombs, and the indignation I felt is still with me to this day. I remained alert, and Hiroshima remained both real and symbolic. Real as total evil, symbolic of the overkill that runs through the history of the United States. Hiroshima had become thus the perfect achievement of Western civilization, the dream of Faust made true, the invention of a weapon that could annihilate the planet and probably change the makeup of the universe. So, Etel wrote, Hiroshima remains central to my being. Here are some of the appearances of Hiroshima in Etel's writing. Listen for the sky, the sun, fire, terror, water. That is one order in which the bombing was experienced. Listen for the Hiroshimas communicating with each other, forming a network, an insistence, a strength. This is Japan drowned and resurrected, resurrected but still dying, drinking water and emerging, swimming from underwater and drowning in a transistorized version of Hiroshima, a funeral march for the first cosmonaut. She wrote long letters full of puns with trembling hands. Her eyes were as clear as the sky the morning before Hiroshima. The Indian never had a horse. God's youthfulness has disappeared. He was immense and he shrunk. They're trying to give him back his wings, but these are not taking off. An airplane bombing the hell out of a city is younger than God. Hiroshima is younger too. Look, I am forced to love planes, speed, terror, master of the eclipse. Where do intimate things hide? Could it be in the mass of flesh, bones, ligaments, disposables that run into rivers? We project them in magnificent drawings by Rembrandt, in Mozart's melodies, although they can well rejoin that cancer that ate Hiroshima. We caress with our spirit the withdrawn manifestations of the unknown, seasons. The sun, fearing Hades, is reluctant to leave the shores of the Hudson. The cost of terror increases at the same rate as the prices for skyscrapers. But who, besides some Hiroshima survivor, gives a damn? Celestial City. Fires are proliferating indeed. One can say that Hiroshima was a mega bonfire, a defining one. The rest of the world slept very well that night, shifting the silence. And the night is an island covered with snow, life always in the present tense, in the nonchalance of a stream. In the other world, where will I find lodging for the Indians, the Hiroshima people, the many, many never buried, and where Omar Khayyam, he the dust, covered with his own words, night. Etel told me a story once about Omar Khayyam. Here she is again, same email, July 1st, 2015. When I was a student in the philosophy department in Berkeley, I went to a lecture by Edward Teller, the father of the atom bomb. It must have been 55 or 56. Those were the years where Heisenberg's theory of indeterminacy had shaken the world of science. The idea that absolute truth is structurally impossible as the observer acts on the thing observed had ruined the self-confidence of the academic world. Teller appeared on stage, not too tall, deadly serious, barely looking at the crowd. He was somber and showing the grandeur of that pessimism invading a world that had come out victorious of a world war. What is unforgettable is that he illustrated the mood of his thinking by quoting, in a clear voice, a sonnet by Omar Khayyam, the great Persian Islamic poet, mathematician, and astronomer of the 11th, 12th centuries. He recited in a hypnotic way the Rubaiyat, the moving finger writes and having writ moves on. It was the greatest poetic experience I ever heard. It still resonates in my ears. In his April 1967 speech on the war in Vietnam, Martin Luther King Jr. also recited from the Rubaiyat, the moving finger writes and having writ moves on, he said. It was the war in Vietnam that inspired Etel to write poems in English. The first she wrote were The Ballad of the Lonely Knight in Present-Day America and The Enemy's Testament. I became an American poet by writing against the Vietnam War, she said. In her essay, Growing Up to be a Woman Writer in Lebanon, she writes, the war happened, and I put my energies into the anti-war movement, writing my first poetry in the language and the land of America. The language and the land of America are haunted by the uses to which they have been put. When Etel says, I became an American poet by writing against the Vietnam War, I take it to mean that to become an American poet, one must write against the violence America commits. Violence that is transpiring, leaking, and unavoidable through the language and the land. What do we inherit from that? What does our poetry inherit? Must we inherit the violence we must write against to write against it? Is the inability of the language and the land to contain that by which it is haunted the incitation to poetry? In The Beauty of Light, Etel says, I'm asked sometimes, why is there so much history of contemporary war in your poetry? I've answered, because it's not me that writes, it's history that writes it. About the Arab apocalypse, she said, history wrote that poem, not me. In other words, history comes naturally. Hiroshima was also a continual presence for Mahmoud Darwish. In Memory for Forgetfulness, his odyssey through Beirut on August 6th, Hiroshima Day, during Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 1982, Darwish writes, in Ibrahim Muhawi's translation, Hiroshima tomorrow. Hiroshima is tomorrow. Incidentally, Darwish died on August 9th, 2008, Nagasaki Day. In his speech on Vietnam, King said, we are now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. Less than 1 month into the present phase of Israel's ongoing genocide of the Palestinian people, comparisons started being made between Gaza and Hiroshima. The comparisons focused on bombs, though, not on people. By November 2023, Israel had shot 25,000 tons of bombs at Gaza, which exceeded by 10,000 tons the combined weight of the bombs shot at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Over the next 12 months, Israel shot 85,000 tons of bombs at Gaza, far exceeding the comparison. Yet Hiroshima remained the control against which the weight of the genocide was being tested. The comparisons did little to conceal the fact that Israel and the United States were fulfilling, through this ineluctable tonnage, their ideologies of genocidal violence, their achievement of nationhood as armory. What was also being quantified was, even more demonically, aspiration. Comparisons could have been made with the 30,000 bombs the U.S. shot at Iraq in 2003, with the 635,000 tons of bombs the U.S. shot at Korea, with the more than 2 million tons of bombs the U.S. shot at Laos, with the more than 7 million tons of bombs the U.S. shot at Vietnam, and so on. But none of these comparisons would have indulged so sensationally the symbolism of Hiroshima as the outer limit of devastation. Tons of suffering, Etel writes in the Arab apocalypse. Millions of dollars of pain, tons of crushed flesh, millions of dollars of hatred, tons of sorrow, tons of despair. The bombs shot at Hiroshima and Nagasaki and Gaza are each other's embodied and disembodying shadow. I have spent years reading Hibakusha testimonies, including the most unimaginable descriptions of what the bombs did to people's bodies. But over the last year and a half, I saw the realization of those descriptions in what Israel has been doing to Palestinians. I realized something crucial, though, that when we are looking at a picture of Hiroshima after the bomb, we are not looking at the ruins of Hiroshima. We are looking at the ruins of America. When we are looking at pictures of Jabalia in November 2023, or the Tel al-Sultan refugee camp in Rafah in May of 2024, or the tents outside Al-Aqsa Hospital in October of 2024, we are not looking at the ruins of Gaza. We are looking at the ruins of Israel and America. It is not empire in this case, or ever, that survives and has a compelling story to tell. When Nihon Hidankyo, a group of hibakusha who have been fighting for 70 years for the abolition of nuclear weapons, won the 2024 Nobel Peace Prize, its co-chair, Toshiyuki Mimaki, compared the atomic bombing to the genocide. He was not basing his comparison on bombs, tonnage, money, or materiel. He was basing it on something beyond quantification. When I saw the children being carried, he said, it was the same as Japan 80 years ago. The images overlap. He did not specify the images he saw or the ways they overlapped. He remembered being one of those children. He was reminded that he was still one of those children. He could not believe that the Nobel Peace Prize was not awarded to the people in Palestine. I thought for sure it would be the people working so hard in Gaza, he said. I write in anger, Etel said in an interview with Hans Ulrich Obrist. My first thought is always explosive. Jebu is angry and explosive. It begins with an epigraph from the Bible, Samuel 2, chapter 5, verses 6 through 8, in which King David goes to Jerusalem and meets the inhabitants there, the Jebusites. And the Jebusites tell King David that he cannot enter the city, but King David enters anyway and tells his men to smite the Jebusites, and he calls the city Zion. Etel calls it Jebu, and invents an opposing liberatory king who wakes from his tomb and comes back, as Etel said, to defend Palestine. What ensues is one of the great poems of the 20th century. As Amel said, Etel was a revolutionary poet. Actually, Jebu, Beirut Hell Express, Beirut 1982, The Arab Apocalypse, and Janine constitute for me the greatest poems of the cosmological record. What is the relationship between the cosmos and conscience? Etel was a poet of both. By conscience, I mean the root through which the dead speak to us, balance us, and continue to feel. It is not that Etel brings the dead back from death, but that she brings death into life, so the dead can be respected and given space as they are, appraised and appreciated in the specificity of their being. It parallels, in fact, the Japanese tradition of obon, when the ancestors return to the living and the living welcome them home, although I also, and I've always conceived of obon as when the ancestors simultaneously reveal themselves and let themselves be revealed, and in that way return the living to life. There is a spring under the ground, Etel writes in Jebu. There is a spring under the ground, the resurrection not of the dead, but of the living. And Jebu says in response, I bring the new gods, make of flesh the future open, the resurrection of the poor, liberation, liberty, liberation. Palestine, Etel writes in Jebu. Palestine is a land planted by eyes, refusing to be closed. Love to Etel. Thank you.
To stand, right? Yeah, we can do it. Thank you, Brandon. Huda Fakhreddine is a writer, a translator, and associate professor of Arabic literature at the University of Pennsylvania. She is the author of 2 scholarly books, Metapoesis in the Arabic Tradition, 2015, and The Arabic Prose Poem, Poetic Theory and Practice, 2021, and also the co-editor of the Routledge Handbook of Arabic Poetry. She has authored many translations, for instance, The Sky That Denied Me, selections from Huda Fakhreddine, and The Universe All at Once, selections from Salim Barakat. More recently, Palestinian, a sequence of poems by Ibrahim Nasrallah, and others. Her creative writings include a book of creative nonfiction titled Zaman Saghir Taht Shams Thaniya, A Brief Time Under a Different Sun, 2019, and the forthcoming وَمِن ثَمَّ الْعَالَمِ, And Then the World, coming out this year. She's also co-editor of Middle Eastern Literatures and an editor of the Library of Arabic Literature. Her talk is titled Poetry Begins at Stop, Etel Adnan and the Arabic Poetic Tradition.
No pressure. Thank you. Yes. Thank you, Omar, for the invitation and the assignment. But before I get to that, I am very overwhelmed, so very grateful for all the speakers who spoke before me. I feel that there's nothing left to say. I'm happy. I don't need to interject or intervene. But I noted that when we all spoke of Etel, we all spoke of time, and we all spoke of ourselves. And when Omar invited me, he gave me an assignment. I'm not sure if everybody else got an assignment. I'm the only one.
Some people got an assignment.
But mine was difficult. Mine was something I couldn't but do. It was an offer I couldn't refuse. Omar said, how is Etel Adnan an Arab or Arabic poet? I couldn't let that go. I abandoned my family, I cleared my schedule. And I sat there thinking, and I wrote something new. You gave me license to ramble and be incoherent, so it is rambling and incoherent, but it's fascinating to me that we all created something for this moment, and I'm very grateful for that. So this reminds me of 2 things. You said, we took you seriously, very seriously, and I ended, up discovering things about myself. And Simone, you asked Omar to be personal, and this is very personal, as you will see. So I'm going to be sharing or maybe oversharing. But to give you context, in the emails between Omar and me, as we were, sharing, I was expressing my absolute admiration of Safira, because before this performance, Omar shared a YouTube of her playing Nahr al-Khalid, and it just blew my mind away. I was cynical about this new generation. It just shut me up. And it answered the question of how is one an Arab? It made me think of my daughter, and I realized that if I want my daughter somehow to be an Arab, I want her to be an Arab this way, with this kind of connection and ability to perform Arabness, whatever that is, through song and poetry and words that travel and survive. So the context, though, in the email where we were mainly talking about Safira, Omar said, how is Etel Adnan an Arab poet? And he quoted from Hillary's interview with Etel. And I'm reading something Etel is saying about herself as an Arab poet. She says, when the Syrian poet Nazir al-Azmi wrote that I was the greatest woman Arab poet since Al-Khansa of pre-Islamic times, I was delighted and profoundly moved. Not only was this a great compliment, but it also allayed one of my greatest fears, that because I wrote in a foreign language, my work would not be considered part of Arab literature. I've always regretted not writing in Arabic, and therefore running the risk of not actually being accepted as an Arab writer. You may be wondering why I don't write in Arabic. Well, it is such a beautiful language. It almost breaks my heart not to write in Arabic. But the main reason is the colonial school system that was imposed on Lebanon during my childhood. And there I was put on the spot and exposed. And I wrote this thing or thought this thing, as Brandon put it, nebulously and with a wandering mind. And it's in 3 parts. And the first part is titled Everyone Lives in Time. I was a 19-year-old English literature major at the American University of Beirut when I first discovered Etel Adnan's work. Though I was studying English literature, I insisted on grounding every question and inquiry in Arabic, that world I had brought with me from home. I spent most of the time in the Arabic Literature and Language department, where I also minored. In every space and circle on campus, I remained on alert, acutely aware of a grand irony in which we, students and faculty, especially those invested in language and literature, were implicated. The labels, department titles, the major descriptions, and the specialty delineations all felt at times tongue-in-cheek. We were constantly engaged in maintaining the pretense of our positionality, sustaining fictions of ourselves within the world enclosed by that campus. And I inhabited 2 of the most irony-fraught spaces. In the English department, we were mostly Lebanese students and faculty, with the occasional American professor, often a young, fresh graduate who had come to Beirut to live out an experience, a world adventure within the safe parameters of an American campus in the conflict-ridden, paradoxical Middle East, before returning to the US to really begin their career. As English majors, we mostly spoke, thought, and wrote in English about writers and texts from an elsewhere we convinced ourselves we belonged to, even inhabited. The fiction was easy to maintain within Fisk Hall, where our department was housed, overlooking the Green Oval and Nicely Hall. It was a beautiful elsewhere, one in which we could be ourselves, but differently, maybe even better. We all looked the part and sounded it. In the Arabic department, I was part of a smaller cohort, but we were similarly invested in necessary fictions. Here, we were all Lebanese, with the occasional Arab student or faculty member. We were deliberately and insistently of Arabic, even though we all knew to resort to English in matters of efficiency, practicality, and real institutional consequence. In some ways, the fiction here in the Arabic department was more high maintenance and the dissonance louder. We prided ourselves on the history of the department, dropping names like Ihsan Abbas, Khalil Hawi, Constantine Izrei, in casual conversations as if to remind ourselves of where we were in geography and history. To varying degrees, we all sensed a shift, a different inflection, an altered resonance that figures like Abu Tammam, Imru al-Qais, Ibn Jinni, even Mahmoud Darwish and Nizar Qabbani acquired once we crossed AUB's main gate to study them. Beyond campus, in the city's old cafes and bookstores, they simply existed. They were of the place and they belonged to everyone. You could choose to engage with them or not, but either way, they were there. Ignore them, and they ignored you too, but both of you still existed. Inside the university, however, past the main gate's proclamation that we were to have life and have it more abundantly, existence itself, having life, became a project and endeavor reserved for those admitted to the institution, the ID-carrying select few. Suddenly, a power dynamic emerged. Imru al-Qais and Mutanabbi and Abu Tammam became native, indigenous. They blurred, needing to be rediscovered, pulled from some darkness. You could choose to engage with them and they would make a great topic, or you could ignore them and they would cease to exist. I was 19 years old. I was a 19-year-old majoring in English, minoring in Arabic at the American University of Beirut when I first discovered Etel Adnan's work. By then, I had learned to exist in and maintain fictions about myself, the institution, the city, the country, the world, to refract history and geography in ways necessary to support a plan for the future, outward and away. I discovered Etel Adnan's work in a class on Arab American literature. yet another fiction only the privileged members of that charmed campus knew about, I would have never imagined that I would become one myself. And I find a lot of comfort and solace in the thought that Etel Adnan became an American in opposition of America's violence, and I will hold on to that. By then, I had lived in Beirut all my life. When I was 19, Beirut and I had made some progress reconciling with our scarred bodies and ourselves in the post-time. It was not clear, at least not to me, what it was that we had left behind in the post-time, but I knew something was behind us, and we were now unlike ourselves as we had always known them. I was beginning to discover Beirut as a city on my own terms. I, like her, had only recently come out of war and could only see her through the blindnesses of small histories. I could still see in my mind and on the ground the violent demarcations, the lines that separated the city into cities and us into us and them. By then, I was also aware of an existing and growing tradition of the Lebanese war novel, and I was already suspicious. No matter how much they tried to include and transcend and step back and remain unimplicated, most novels seem to describe a war smaller than the one I lived and easier to explain and sort out. Before I read Sitt Mary Rose, I had never imagined that a novel about Beirut could be written this way, accounting for history without being implicated in it, having a voice and voices at the same time, telling the story of the petty, the small, the criminal, as well as the just, the pure, and the true, without compromising either. Etel showed me how to survive the narratives of war, or the war of narratives. As I was trying to find my Beirut, after we had both come out of the bomb shelter and had to recognize each other in the daylight, Etel Adnan shared with me a discovery, a secret, that it was possible to survive history and still live in time, all of time. While the memorable and quotable moments in Sitt Mary Rose are many, one has always stood out to me, as if giving me directions as I walked from my parents' house in Hamra to campus on Bliss Street. In this scene, Sitt Mary Rose is waiting for her Palestinian lover in a cafe in Hamra, and he hasn't arrived yet, and she comes to a realization, and I'm quoting. Suddenly, she felt a need to confide in him the discovery of the day, an idea of the kind she hadn't had for very long. On her walk from her house to this cafe, where she was waiting for the box office at the Sarulla cinema to open for the 9 o'clock show, a huge idea filled her brain. Each passing person, she said, is full of his own term of time. Everyone lives in time, with a capital T. If then one added every second lived by each of the people, lived by each of us, by all the people of the world, at this precise moment, it would make all the eternity of time. She told herself she had just discovered a new dimension. Everyone lives in time, Etel writes, in the eternity of time. So I didn't have to subscribe to beginnings and endings, to breaks and resets, to befores and afters, and Beirut didn't either. She could pile up all her seconds and minutes of life and make an eternity of her own. It is this contending with time, molding a narrative out of it as opposed to in it, that makes Sitt Mary Rose unlike any other war novel, at least in my experience as a reader and a survivor of war. And perhaps to write with integrity about the incestuous, tribal, brotherly slaughter of the Lebanese civil war might not have been possible in Sitt Mary Rose had it not also been a story about Palestine. But more about that later. In my first encounter with Etel, I discovered writing that places itself in all of time, survives history as it accounts for it and as it holds it accountable. Writing that remains true to a place but survives its language or languages without betrayal or abandon. And later, when I read Etel Adnan's poetry, I also discovered how one can be loyal to a language even when writing in another, how one can belong to a poetic tradition from a distance. 2, poetry begins at stop. Because beginnings are difficult and very meaningful, Because they are thresholds between worlds, once the right one is found, it becomes a mark, a sign, a contract. A beginning is not just an action, Edward Said tells us. A beginning is more than anything a consciousness. And Arabic poetry, as a form of thought, as memory, as imagination, as a mode of existence, has found the perfect beginning. At stop. The stance upon the ruins or the ruined abodes, what we call in Arabic al-wuquf ala al-atlal, which is the archetypal beginning or start of the Arabic poem. It is where the Arabic poetic consciousness begins to form. It is where the qasida, the archetypal Arabic poetic form, becomes conscious of itself as a world. Arabic poetry begins at stop because the poet of Arabic cannot find voice or a threshold into the poem without demanding that time stop. And in that stopping, time itself becomes a place. Chiseling. Remember, we were chiseling things. Time itself becomes, and chiseling is what time does to rock in the opening of the Arabic poem. In that stopping, time itself becomes a place, a moment to inhabit as the poet reorients time, resets it, and launches it again in a world of our own making. Wuquf ala al-atlal, or the stance upon ruins, and the many variations on this convention, is the most common opening of Arabic poems from pre-Islamic times to this very day. Arabic language found its poetic spark in the site of loss, in the ruins of place that become a portal in time. And the qasida is a monumental structure, an outstanding identification or mark of what it is to be Arab. It presents to us the original landscape, geographical, psychological, linguistic, and emotional, among others. It has served as the primary field of reference for all of Arabic poetry. It is the enduring edifice with which Arab poets, even today, have to negotiate a relationship or a truce before they move forward. And it is intriguing and fascinating and makes perfect sense that this monumental structure always begins in the site of ruin. The Arabic qasida always begins with a reflection on time in space, a prelude known as the Nasib, and this is the boring professor of Arabic literature at the University of Pennsylvania. We can skip. So this is the centrality of the ruin or the talal. The poet stands, remembers time, thinks of mortality, remembers of beloveds lost, of places gone forever, before the poem can happen, before the journey of the poem can start. And in this scene, which are rooted some of the most quintessentially Arab utterances, not even lines, and of course I'm thinking of Mru'ul Qais, the author of one of the first Mu'allaqa, who says, "Stop, two friends, and we will weep," or "Stop, two friends, and let us weep for the memory of one beloved," and an abode at Siqt al-Liwa between Dakhul and Hawmal. But that can't be translated. He says, "قفا نبكي من ذكرى حبيب ومنزلي بسقط اللوى بين الدخول فحوملي." قفا نبكي. Stand, stop, and let us weep. This is the most resounding announcement that Arabic poetry will happen next. Stand and weep. Despite its sometimes irreconcilable or incompatibility with the eventual purpose or theme of the qasida, this opening not only became indispensable, but came to be the mark of the genre, the key to the world of Arabic poetry. And the examples are many, and listen to some of them, and they will all begin with stop. This is Dabil al-Khuzai, who says, "Stop and let us ask the abandoned dwelling, when was its last pledge to fasting and prayers?" Meaning time. When did it mark time? قفا نسأل الدار التي خف أهلها متى عهدها بالصوم والصلوات. Zuhair ibn Abi Sulma, another pre-Islamic poet, says, "Stop by the dwellings, or stop by the trace that has remained. Oh, but how it has been altered by the winds and rains. قف بالديار التي لم يعفها القدم بلى وغيرها الأرواح والديم." Antara, the famous pre-Islamic poet, they're all famous, and they're all men, by the way, but we'll talk about that later, says, "Stop at these ruins if their sights move you. Perhaps your eyes will shed tears," and tears here are code for poetry. Perhaps you'll be able to say something. قف بالمنازل إن شجتك ربوعها فلعل عينك يستهل دموعها. He also says, so the examples here are many, and the translations, of course, deliberately all begin with stop. A last example from Antara, who says, stop at the traces of home and call out to the wasteland. Perhaps these ruins will answer the one who calls. قف بالديار وصح إلى بيداها فعسى الديار تجيب من ناداها. To be an Arab poet or a poet of Arabic, Antara tells us one should be forever compelled to stand upon the unfathomable ruin, the unbearable loss, and to call out into the wasteland, as futile as that may seem. And Etel agrees. She knows that we can only find meaning there on that plane where desolation and memory intersects. In time, and I'm reading Sarah Rigg's translation, Etel says, the heart's desertion is memory's fingerprint. And the conversation I hear Etel Adnan having in Arabic is not only limited to Al-Khansa, whom she was aware of because she was mentioned as an Arab woman poet. Al-Khansa, whom we have pigeonholed as the token Arab woman poet as well. This is an injustice to both of them, to Al-Khansa and to any woman poet who follows her. Al-Khansa was a master of elegy. She was a master of form. She was in conversation with the foremost poets of this genre, and she outdid them all because she knew that the ritha, the elegy, the lament, especially of those unjustly taken, demands justice. The sister of lament is revenge. The sister of lament is justice. And if justice is not served, the form, the ritha, will go on forever, will occupy the entire world. And that's why Khansa outdid all of her male peers and became a master of form. Etel is in conversation with Khansa on this level and with other poets who mastered the conversation with time. And that is a conversation that happens across generations, across continents, across languages. Consider Antara, back to Antara, who posed the most pressing question any poet can ask. He said, is there anything left to say? هل غادر الشعراء من متردم أم هل عرفت الدار بعد توهمي? Have the poets left a stone unturned? Did you recognize the abode after it was blurred? But then he turns around and finds his poem in the rubbles. He turns around and writes a poem launching from the site of ruin, in the stones that keep coming back in memory. Etel Adnan stands where Antara stood and asks, and I'm quoting again from Time, Etel says, what's memory doing among these stones that keep coming back? She older than creation and anxious to say it? She and Antara, Etel and Antara, are of the same tradition that insists on questioning time in the moment of desolation. And Etel describes this lineage well. She says, from Time again, the ruins are relics, the lineage being of little importance, we're all related to them. Poetry begins at stop, and Etel knew that very well. Oh, disaster, stop. Oh, sun, stop. Bliss, stop. Stop, a broken engine, an eye rounded and yellowed by the prison, stop. Etel's stop, in caps, all caps, punctuates the apocalypse, her apocalypse, our apocalypse, the unfolding of Arab and of human history. Stop resets it and relaunches it, continuously returning it to that moment which sounds and feels so Arabic to me. When the poet confronts all of time, the eternity of time, in a single line, in a metaphor, with the power of naming things and the ability to discover that new dimension of existence in all of time or in the eternity of time. Etel had a relationship with Arabic poetry and with Arab poets, and we note, the many conversations with, evocations of, and dedications to poets like Badr Shaker Sayab, Buland al-Haydari, Abdul Wahab al-Bayati, Talal Haydar, and others. To me, her eloquent and critically insightful visual translation of Sayab's Unshudat al-Matar stands out as a token of this long-distance love affair with Arabic, as she describes it. But no, seriously, you have to think of this. You have to look at this painting as a critical analysis, not only of the poem's mood and themes and images, but of its form, the way it unfolds, the way the panels speak to each other. And if you know Thayeb's poem, you understand that this is a poem in form, as revolutionary and modernist as it is, but it keeps form. It sits in it as uncomfortable as form can be, because we portray it as a limitation. He launches from form and soars. And of course, the often cited statement, "I paint in Arabic." This is not only a beautiful linguistic solution to the exile's predicament, but it is a profound acknowledgement of an undercurrent, an informing ethos, an Arabic energy to which she belonged. Etel Adnan demonstrates how one can belong to a tradition, can adopt its most fundamental stance, and commit to it, even if writing at the distance of many languages, countries, and identity labels away. Etel Adnan was mistaken to think that other Arab poets were closer to the truth than she was because they were more of this place. And she says that in reference to Talal Haidar in Time as well. She was mistaken because the place to which the Arab poet or the Arab poet of Arabic belongs is that moment which is the prehistory where we ran. It is a time that becomes place. It is a landscape for the journey that is the Arabic poem. And Etel knew this well. At least I can hear her say it in this other quote from Time. She says, "I am hungry for the ruins where I was running in prehistory. I will travel motionless." And finally, my last movement here is titled Finally Lament and Its Sister Justice. Ghassan Kanafani is our no-nonsense, no-bullshit visionary. He continuously and deliberately and stubbornly astonishes us with what we already know, wielding a courage as irrefutable and necessary as daylight. He cuts through the noise of identity politics with 3 simple Arabic words. Al-insan huwa qadiyya. The person is a cause. The human being is a cause. And over the past century, to be a human being, not just a Palestinian or a Lebanese or an Arab, but to be a human being is to be of Palestine. To belong to the Arabic language and its creative memory and its long tradition of poets who sang of loss, revenge, and justice is to be of Palestine. And Etel knew this well. Even now, she teaches us how to be loyal to that cause, not through the posturing or the peddling of identity politics, which we see these days all too often, but with a Kanafanian courage, certainty, and conviction. And so on this day 510 of genocide, allow me to end by reading from her poem Jenin, one of our many oracle ruins, Jenin, a place that becomes a portal in time. And the poem opens with the quintessentially Arabic stance upon ruins and desolation. And that night, when it stopped raining tigers and room dividers, while those who came to commit armed robbery went away with pittance, after the closure of the bitter cafes and the time for bordellos to start receiving their clients, when wicks had burnt out in their lamps and the priests had returned to their customary pedophilia, when the rain got scared because bombs were running faster than the speed of light, a thick smoke made of bones burned over a soft fire and transformed into calcium Palestine descended. This is a stance upon the ruins. This is a wuquf ala al-atlal. And Jenin ends with a promise of return, a victory against all odds. But they came, the bastards, to eradicate with bombs, to tell very simply that we didn't exist. They started with the olive trees, and then with the orchards, then with the buildings, and when all had disappeared, they threw one on top of the other, the children, the old and the newlyweds, in a mass grave. All that to tell the world of the half-dead that we didn't exist, that we have never existed, and therefore they were right to exterminate us all. A poem itself is survival. Etel knew this well. But a poem written post-extermination is victory. Etel knew this very well. A poem written post-extermination is the return of a voice. It is a victory in the longest of terms. It is a victory in time. Thank you.
Should we go back? I don't know. I'm full and grateful. I think if Brandon and Huda agree to entertain observations or questions, let's take some. But we don't have to. There is. Can I give you the microphone?
This is probably a question for you. Are there any plans to publish all these amazing talks?
The answer is yes. I mean, I can't decide by myself, but everybody who is participating was approached and with the idea also that what happens here, that we would like to publish it. We'll see, but it looks like maybe that will happen. Brandon, you have stories? We're all overwhelmed. I can't think of anything. Yeah. We don't have to have questions right away. We can also just breathe for a moment, and if something emerges, we can take it. I don't know if it's a story, it's a memory of reading, thinking of Etel as an Arabic poet. I maybe have wrote it to you in the email as well, the initial email, but in the story that Amel referenced, Master of the Eclipse, which is the title and longer story in that book of short stories, Master of the Eclipse, it's one of the places where Etel references Iraq. There are many places, but in that case, it references Buland al-Haydari, who was an Iraqi poet, and is a portrait of him in a way. But it also references a trip that Etel and Simone took to Iraq in 1974, I think it was. And one of the scenes in that story always struck me as very beautiful and moving, which is when she finds herself in an assembly of Iraqi poets thinking that they don't know her because they don't have any reason to, in a way. She writes in English, etc., or in French, and they start reciting to her in Arabic her poems that they read in shi'r, in magazines in Lebanon, in translation. So she's surprised by her own kind of by the fact that her belonging to the group is offered to her in that kind of context as a surprise. I don't know if the mic will go that far.
I guess this is a question for Brandon. You're talking about the desire for an American context, the desire for atonement, for the release of guilt and shame. Talking about Hiroshima, I'm like writing a lot about this as a Palestinian, where I feel like a lot of people approach me for a desire to, group like atonement of their shame or guilt. What are other things that you think people deserve, or what do you think Americans with that kind of complex, like what is the response
Thank you for that question. Can we talk later? I feel so emotional right now. I don't think I can get my wits together, but I would love to answer that. Thank you.
Amel?
Well, just your story reminded me of another story, which, I don't think is tangential. During the war in Bosnia, I was translating a lot of poets, and I always figured out a way to get in touch with them. And obviously, if there was any money, to get the money to them one way or another. And there was one person that for some reason I could not get in touch with, Abdullah Sidran, who is well known as a scenographer. He wrote several screenplays that were quite well known, but he was a great poet. And so about a week after the ceasefire, I drove from Split with a friend who I also translated, who was a journalist, Zlatko Dizdarevic, and a friend of his who hadn't been out of the siege the whole time. And we drove through really destroyed areas, Mostar, and we got to Sarajevo, and I said, what's Sidran's number? I want to call him. So I call him, and he says, who's this? And I say, Alkali. And he said, I thought you were dead. And I said, I thought you were dead. And he said, where are you? I said, I'm at Zlatko's. He said, go out, get a taxi, tell them to take you to Sidran's. Everybody knows where I live, and come over. So I did. I get in a cab. I get out. He opens the door, and he recites a poem of mine that he translated like 15 years ago. So there you go. And he just passed away recently. So that's right.
Thank you for that.
I would like to make a comment about Etel being an Arab poet. Most translations always look like translations, whatever the craft and the wonderful talent of the translator. But I always told Etel that when she's translated into Arabic, it looks as if it was written in Arabic. Go ahead. No, that's okay. Now about Hiroshima. When you said, Brandon, that it is still an American problem, that people should face this event, I remember talking with a friend of ours, great friend of Etel's, a doctor who had been in the war in the South Pacific. And somehow he said, we didn't know it was just having a bigger bomb. I said, yes, maybe for the first time, but you did drop it a second time. So he had nothing to say about this.
Thank you. This is a question for Huda about something you said when you were talking about the first woman Arabic poet, and you were, correct me if I'm wrong on any of this. This is how I remember what you said. You were talking about how her poetry, beginning looking around at the ruins, is that her poetry is particularly more successful than the others because it's a form of lament. And then you went on to say that the poem wouldn't end until there was justice, but you also used the word revenge. And I kind of started at that, and I wonder if you could just clarify what you were saying.
Yes, thank you for this question. I have to take responsibility for my words. I was also aware of myself saying revenge. All of Arabic, classical, pre-modern Arabic poems written in the qasida form begin with the stance upon ruins. Al-Khansa was not the first woman poet, but she's the one that the records highlight. There were many before her and after her, but history is written by men, and they need something huge to capture their attention. So what Khansa is remembered for is that she wrote a qasida of ritha, meaning a lament qasida. It opens traditionally, but it laments the murder of her two brothers. Her two brothers were murdered, and she spent her entire life lamenting, mourning them to exaggeration. She is a poet who lived in pre-Islamic times, but also witnessed the rise of Islam. And there are many accounts of her later in Islam where people would take her aside and say, you need to take this down a notch. You can't go on like this. This lament betrays a lack of faith, and she would resist that. She would say, as long as their justice has not been served, I will continue to lament to the ends of the world. My use of the word revenge refers to poetic form. So in Arabic, there are two forms that are also sisters or brothers: the lament and al-akhd bil-tha'r. Remember, this was a tribal society where there were no central government, there were no laws. And the tribes often fought and murdered each other. And justice meant if you kill one of us, something has to be done, not necessarily murder, but dues paid, reparations. So revenge means the fulfillment of justice in this context. Something has to make up for this loss, has to counter it. And Khansa never thought anything in the world could make up for the loss of her two brothers. And this is what allowed her to stretch poetic form to its limits. So revenge in this case means justice, meaning the criminal held accountable, and nothing more menacing than that. And I'm really referring to the poetic form. So there are many poems of revenge, of tha'r, that ask for justice. And sometimes justice can be another poem that counters that one poem that demands so powerfully for justice, demands justice so powerfully. If another poem can counter it, then soul's calm. But in this case, Khansa's soul never calmed down, and she exaggerated in her grief, as the accounts and her biographies say.
Before that story, I just wanted to thank both Brandon and Huda. Those were absolutely extraordinary, moving, and full of things to really think about. So thank you. Those were amazing.
We have a question at the back. Well, thank you to the Spirit. So for those who didn't hear, today is the first day of the Tibetan New Year, so we're thanking the Spirit of Giorno for having us here. Thank you very much. Over there. Let me see if this reaches you.
This is an exploratory question. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Huda. Thank you, Brandon. Okay, if Etel standing on the ruins is a part of her as an Arabic poet, I think about her also as like what characterizes American poetry, and like I'm thinking about the space between standing on the ruins and negative capability. I don't mean to be like a poet in this space, but does anybody know like if Etel had thoughts on negative capability and what her relationship was to that? Amel, I see you nodding. Keats, and if anybody wants to talk about negative capability, you can talk about that too. I can give you my rough Twitter definition of it, which is to like look at a thing without seeking to change it, essentially. But maybe the poetry professors proper with the PhDs can tell us how that's correct. And sentimentality. Americans don't like sentimentality, but Etel evokes sentimentality in a lot of ways. So I think of her being an Arab poet in the way that she evokes sentimentality. So that, anybody have thoughts on this? So like, what about her makes her not an American poet? Or what makes her an American? Like, there's something about the dialectical nature of being an American, and that me telling you that I'm an American, even though a lot of us are forced to be here because of circumstance, we're stuck here. So I'm an American in that I'm a thorn in America. So how is Etel a thorn in America, and therefore making her an American? You know what I mean?
You were nodding, Amel, about...
I mean, so, look, the American poetics that grabbed Etel's mind and tongue are not the poets that people study in universities or read, you know. They're just not. And so she got to the heart of what is truly the American idiom, and she got it. Like, she just got it. And as far as negative capability goes, I would say that I would imagine that she thought about it, but I think she might have thought about it via Charles Olson, who talked about it in a book that I'm sure she was familiar with, which Oyez Press published, and it's escaping my mind right now, but he begins with describing Keats and his friend walking along and coming up with this idea of negative capability. But what Olson does is he takes the classical Hegelian dialectic and he replaces the third term with negative capability. And I would imagine it's something that would have really struck a note with Etel. So I don't have proof of this, but that's, I would think, because I know she read Olson seriously and thoroughly. So I would imagine that somewhere in there it came up.
A thorny comment.
No, but you're Lebanese, right? I mean, it's just a general comment or response to your question. I mean, poets don't subscribe to the guidelines of Homeland Security or to citizenship. I mean, I think Etel Adnan was an American poet the way Badr Shakir Sayeb was an Iraqi poet. He was Iraqi because he protested violences in Iraq. I mean, it's very reductive and flattening to say Adonis is a Syrian poet, or Lebanese poet, or Uns al-Hajj is Lebanese. I mean, those are so limiting and narrow. To be a poet means that you give up, relinquish citizenship to artificial collectives like nationalism. And even Arab poets who are real poets gave up their belonging, their membership cards to artificial things like countries, nation states. And when we say, I prefer to say a poet of Arabic, meaning the language and nothing else, just the memory, the thinking force that is a language, and that could be placed anywhere. So yes, I like that we can't really identify or pin down her relationship to America, but also any other poet's relationship to any other country. They're often victims of these identities.
It is 6 p.m. Yes.
We really should be very suspicious of definitions. I don't think we all agree of what American mean, Arabic mean, Arab mean. it depends all the time for the context, for what we're talking about, for everyone's relationship to all these notions. So this is first, you have to take what you understand of it and how you understand somebody's poetry. And definitions are totally superfluous.
On the superfluousness of definitions, we shall end the afternoon. I have one or two things to say. One is we can linger if you have, can have some conversations. We will be packing up some material and all of that. The symposium continues this evening at the Poetry Project, which is maybe a 15-minute walk away north, 2nd Avenue and 11th Street. The program says doors will open at 7, but they will open at 7:30, just so you know, because there's some setting up to be done. But you can arrive earlier if you feel like it. The doors will open at 7:30, and there will be some food. And then there will be poetry readings by Sarah Riggs and George Abraham. There will be the presentation of a new book that gathers together three essays by Etel, and there will be a musical performance by Amir Safar. And see you there, I hope.